pharaohs Quendam's side. Zara I, the first, the risen pharaoh and eternal god queen of the Solution dominion. Description: Zara I was, like some others in this new world, the result of Vale deciding to steal a raid boss out from under the actual raid party's noses. Coming from the second expansion, known as the Sea of Glass, Zara I was supposed to be the big bad antagonist of the expansion. Her backstory was that she was a just and noble pharaoh. However, after realizing her own mortality, she became desperate to find a way to live forever so that she could support her people beyond the limits of her lifespan. Regrettably, she was fooled by a dark sorcerer into drinking what she thought was an elixir of immortality and died on the spot, only to rise again as the undead pharaoh under the control of the evil mage that had killed her. It seems that when Vale tamed her and took her from the raid, she must have lost her connection with the evil wizard who was the secret final boss of said raid. Notably, she and said sorcerer were both tamed by Vale. However, the sorcerer is nowhere to be seen nor heard from in the new world, and it is not a stretch of the imagination to believe that the once puppet pharaoh had not forgotten the deceit and humiliation she had experienced and exacted her vengeance upon her former controller. Now free of the dark mage's control, she has once again led her nation and its people to greatness. However, her sense of mercy and compassion hides the traces of the mind control that made her into a ruthless and cruel tyrant. She still struggles with that to this day, and even as the desert/sand elves push her people further and further away from their borders, she tries desperately to keep herself from lashing out and reverting to the monster she became after her rise into Undeath. The arrival and subsequent mistreatment of the only man she truly has romantic feelings for may well be what tips the scales and forces the pacifist pharaoh to unleash her darker side against those that seek to run her and her people out of their ancestral homeland. A broken bar. Ratams, the general whose loyalty surpassed both death and Undeath. Description: Ratams is a man born from common stock who, under the reign of his pharaoh, Zara I, rose through the ranks to become her greatest general. Although in life his pharaoh desired naught but peace for her people, she also knew that to have peace there must be preparations made in the event of war. Ratams was the answer to that, and as he rose through the ranks, he saw firsthand how much his pharaoh cared for her people. Eventually, he was the one who led her armies, sweeping bandits and other threats from her lands with the ruthless force that his ruler was loath to use. He effectively became both her right and left hand, a person responsible for being both the acts committed in the light and those done in the dark. He was, unfortunately, unable to stop his pharaoh from falling to the evil wizard who then used her as an undead puppet, and even as he tried to fight for his pharaoh's freedom, he found that more and more of his men were being slain and raised into Undeath. Eventually, he was alone, surrounded by a nation ruled by fear and pain where the living envied the dead who held power over them. Deciding that he could not face his ancestors if he let this stand, he led a one-man assault on Zara I's palace, only to fall before his pharaoh's overwhelming power. He next awoke as an undead, but his will was too strong for the evil mage to control, and the bastard was forced to choose between controlling him and the undead legions or his pharaoh and the same. Free of his shackles, he ran and sought help from others to put his beloved monarch out of her misery and free his homeland. In the new world, he once again serves his glorious god queen as he had done in life, but her unwillingness to set him loose upon the invading desert/sand elves has given him pause. He is fully aware of the struggle inside his pharaoh regarding her hatred of who she had been forced to become, and knows fully that unless something is done quickly his monarch will have her mind shatter like glass. The arrival of Vale may yet give him the ability to act on the threats that encroach upon the Dominion, and hopefully give his pharaoh some relief from her in a battle. A broken bar. Desert/sand elves side. Melach the cruel/great, the monster with two faces, one for friends and one for foes. Description: Melach is, without a doubt, the epitome of his kind. Even though desert/sand elves are known for being overly xenophobic at the best of times and slavers at the worst, Melach seems to take the disdain for all non-desert/sand elves to a whole new level. Any sapient that is not a member of his own subrace will not escape his wrath once he learns of their act of trespassing into what he considers his kind's rightful territory. This means that the Solution Dominion and all within, including the buildings, are targets for him to destroy and despoil. To his people, he seems a godsend. To those who stand outside his people, he is a sated, a merciless monster and a man hell-bent on eradicating any and all traces of them ever having even a single foothold in his destined territory. Ever since he managed to unite the various tribes of his people under his banner, using no small amount of brutality and merciless violence, he has imposed nothing but malice and evil upon any unfortunate enough to cross him, even if they only did so in his own mind. It is unclear where his views, which are extreme even for desert/sand elves, came from, but they seem to have arrived in their current state just a year or so ago, about the time when a massive pulse of power rippled through the world, coming from a single human kingdom. While he had always been violent and heartless before, pushing the pharaoh's people out of their homes with fire and sword, now he is seemingly intent on not only taking their land but also butchering their people and destroying every single trace of their civilization. Some claim he has had a vision of what could be if he does not do what he intends to, and this was what tipped him over the edge. Regardless of where his new heightened capacity for malice comes from, he may well find that the Dominion that once was easy to bowl over will fight back now that his people have wronged the Dominion in a way that was not expected. The appearance and casual disregard of a man buried up to his head in the sand could be what leads to his vision coming true and his people being forced to permanently give up on their deeply rooted ambitions. By the dawning of his second day in what Vale assumed to be an almost perfect copy-paste of the Neon Genesis Fantasia's in-game area known as the Sea of Glass, the attempts at extracting himself from his nearly complete prison of sand had borne fruit. Now all that Vale had to do was find a way to leave the expansive and dangerous desert he had been whisked away to by his own gambit. He had also, during his nearly 19.5-hour struggle to unstick himself, decided on a secondary objective that he figured he may not have the capacity to fulfill. "I'm gonna find those 10 bastards and bury them up to their chins and see how much they like it," Vale shouted to the heavens. However, the heavens either were on another call, had not learned that voicemail was a thing or were otherwise indisposed, so Vale's declaration and demand for revenge fell on deaf ears. Deciding that he could not simply stick around and hope that someone would come and show him the way out, Vale began to trudge forwards through the sand, figuring that if he went in one direction and only one direction he would eventually reach the end of the oversized sandbox he found himself in. As the sun beat down on him from above, cooking the sand beneath his feet into a state that could sear the meat from a man's body, Vale thanked the devs and other people behind the game that he didn't have to suffer such torments. He could only guess how horrible the heat would be to those unused to it, let alone those without the top-tier gear that he possessed. Their environmental hazard immunity, passive ability he had picked up during his time in the game along with the passive buffs placed upon his equipment rocked. He was thankful he had stored a metric buttload of food and drinks in his item storage, as he doubted that there was much of anything in the way of food and water that would be readily available. This was a desert, after all, and most water that one could see would be mirages. With his feet burying themselves deep with every step and the temperature being either brutally hot in the daytime and brutally cold in the night, Vale sighed and muttered to himself as he crested a dune. "This is going to be a long trip." A broken bar. Meanwhile, a skirmish was taking place on the edge of the ever-shrinking Solution Dominion. Around 20 trained warriors and just about the entire village's populace were squaring off against a foe whose numbers and training were vastly superior. "Bastard children of the sun, hear my words," cried a desert elf, otherwise known as a sand elf, who rode atop a palanquin carried by the brutally beaten bodies of his foes. "You and your homes are forfeit. Surrender and accept your place willingly, lest I be forced to make you do so. Your menfolk will be slaughtered, their bodies left to water the sands with their blood and bile, while the women will be made our eternal servants. If you refuse this magnanimous offer of mine, know that death will claim all of you." but only after days of torture and torment the likes of which you cannot imagine. Yield or face a cruel end, these are your only choices. The villagers did not speak a word. They knew that in the end the only thing waiting for them was death, as the monster of a man who sat just out of arrow range never intended to show even the slightest sliver of mercy. They had all heard the stories told by the handful of people who were allowed to walk free after being brutalized and having their homes razed, and not a soul believed that the women would not be brutally slaughtered after the surrender. The women would not even be raped beforehand, just cruelly tormented, and then gritted to death by their own intestines. You refuse to submit? Then face the judgment we bestow upon you. I, Melach the Great, gave you a chance to settle things peacefully, but you have made your choice. Now, die like the deranged animals that you are. A broken bar. Another day had passed for Vale as he continued his march through the sea of glass, and now the merciful in-between period of the day where the temperature was neither overly hot or cold had settled in. He still had enough energy to continue his march for another day or so, but he was slowly wearing through the absurdly high stamina that even a specially built max-level player like himself would have in reserve. He was just about to crest another dune when he noticed a blackish-grey pillar of smoke coming from just off his 2 o'clock. Finally, he thought aloud, some trace of civilization in this sandy hell. Throwing caution to the wind, he picked up the pace and trudged ever faster through the dunes, hoping that he would reach his target destination before the signal faded away and left him without any guiding landmarks once again. A broken bar. When the sand demons came, her mother had instructed her to hide and not come out until she had come to take her. However, a long time had passed, and her mother had still not come to tell her that it was safe. Now she was getting worried, for the smell of iron and charred meat filled her nose along with the scent of burning wood. The already uncomfortable heat of the day was now added to by the heat of what she assumed were fires, and the sounds of battle that had once rung out were now long gone, replaced by the crackling of flames and the noise of the sand demons looting everything they could get their hands on. So, like the good and smart little girl that she was, she kept herself concealed until the majority of the sounds died down. She figured that by now the sand demons had moved on, and now was a safe time to leave her hiding spot. She was sorely mistaken. As she poked her head out from under the lid of the hollow drop that she had concealed herself in, she found herself face to face with the sand demon. Its bright green eyes locked onto hers, and the pointed ears that barely poked out from under its head were twitched with what she assumed was excitement. The sand demon reached out and yanked her from her hiding spot, and as she was pulled out, she noticed that the heavily tanned skin of the sand demon had flecks of red all over it. She instinctively knew what that red substance was, and as she looked around, she saw the aftermath of the attack on her village. Houses were burned out and collapsed while the torn remains of people of all of the races lay about, all equally on fire. She struggled against her captor, but to no avail. The sand demon was far stronger than she was. She saw the twisted smile of the sand demon and, in that moment, cried out to the pharaoh, the incarnation of the sun goddess herself, to send a divine warrior to avenge the fallen. The sand demons heard her pleas and laughed, but their laughter was cut short when one of them pointed towards something off behind her. The sand demon threw her to the ground and drew its khopesh, only for its head to explode and its body fall backwards as if something had slammed into its uppermost portion. Slowly turning her head, she looked and beheld a being clad in an outfit that was mostly white with red accents. There was a mask covering its face, but even then, she felt a sense of courage rising from within her every second she gazed at the figure. Without a word, the figure moved forward and began to fight the sand demons. And the fight was glorious. Vale had, deep down in the bottom of his soul, hoped that the rising column of dark smoke was the result of some celebration or another and not the result of a brutal massacre. And to be frank, his hopes were proven true, at least from a certain point of view, that is. Yes, there was indeed celebration in the streets and roaring bonfires where meat and other things were cooked, but the people celebrating were not the natives, and the things being cooked on the houses turned bonfires were members of the races, not animal or even monster meat. This immensely rustled Vale's jimmies, and he was not going to tolerate such actions so long as it wasn't one of his tamed beings doing the deed. Although, even then, He had a line that, in his own mind, could never be crossed, and these vandals had certainly done so with reckless abandon. Upon closer inspection, the people partying over the broken and burning village were desert elves, also known as sand elves, also known as the worst elves. Upon acquiring this information, Vale quickly realized that if they were willing to do this here, then there was a very good chance that they would, and quite possibly had, done this elsewhere. Just as he started formulating a plan of attack, he heard a child cry out in terror and pain. Pulling up his minimap, he scanned the entire village for any sign of a neutral or allied NPC. With seconds to spare, he found a single green blip surrounded by 5 red ones. The green dot was slowly losing hit points, and if Vale did nothing, he would lose not only someone partially connected with him, likely via one of his tamed beings, but also a source of information. He was glad that his feet were no longer sinking into the sand as the ground was now more or less solid, and with a brisk jog by the standards of max-level players, he made his presence known to the trash that thought tormenting a small child was a fun game to play. Almost immediately, one of the 5 found that their attention spent towards the little girl was better spent focused on Vale, and Vale gave them further reason to do so by picking up a stone and tossing it like a fastball into the head of a sand elf. The rock connected and the sand elf's head popped like a rotten orange shot with a .45 Magnum hollow point bullet. The desert elf's body fell backwards as the rock continued on its trajectory, flying dangerously close to the body of what Vale assumed was a dead villager and rocketing off into the expansive sandbox that was just beyond the final boundary of the village. This caught the other 4 sand elves off guard, and they took a few steps back both due to shock and a bit of fear. However, they quickly re-established their courage and raged with the knowledge that they had been intimidated by a being that was not a member of their own sub-race. Rushing forwards, they met Vale's walking stick head-on. No, literally head-on, as in Vale hit each of them in the head with his stick. And that went about as well as you might expect for the underleveled, by Vale's standards, idiots. Their skulls caved in as a singular blow was dealt to each of them, and Vale left them to die on the ground that they collapsed upon. The commotion caught the attention of the rest of the stragglers that had stayed around to revel in their darker, more destructive urges, and soon more lambs had come for the slaughter. Vale, in typical max-level fashion, completely trashed the fools who had thought that a level between 30 and 40 was a mark of pride, and by the time the last desert elf either lay dead or had run off into the sea of glass there were over 20 bodies piled up in the ruined village square. With that done, Vale turned to the little girl he had saved, only to see her on her knees and praying. But, although it both confused and pleased him greatly, the girl was not praying to him. Said child was kneeling and giving thanks at the base of a statue that reminded him greatly of a famous poem, although the gender of said sculpture was obviously reversed. Still, said larger-than-life idol had obviously seen better days, as it was horribly defaced and had suffered more than a few blows dealt by hammers and the like. Even though the busted bust was barely intact, Vale still felt a sneaking suspicion that he had seen and perhaps even spent time with the person that the statue was based off of. He moved closer and noticed an inscription in hieroglyphics, which he could read due to the traces of the game that were etched upon his soul, that detailed the name of the ruler that the smashed statue was dedicated to. Glory be to the incarnation of the Sunday. Glory be to those who bask in her power. Glory be to the divine Pharaoh, Zara I, she whose light was eclipsed by darkness, only to shine even brighter when the shadows cleared. May her reign never end, so that when the chosen husband of the sun is finally sent, she may embrace him as her divine mate. Zara-ia broken bar. Zara-ia broken bar. Where had Vale heard that name before? On a hunch, Vale popped open the active list of his tamed beings, a list he had not so much as glanced at in quite a while. He scrolled through the list of names, both those that were crossed through due to having died and those that were white, which meant they were still alive. After about 40 seconds of non-stop scrolling, Vale found the name he was looking for, and the memories came flooding back. He was embarrassed with himself that he had forgotten that heist. He had watched the raid party's live streams during his theft and their faces when they found that every single boss and even the named, unique mobs had been stolen right from under their noses gave him no small amount of satisfaction. Besides, their guild was a bunch of self-righteous assholes that nobody liked, so fucking them over was a good thing. But, yeah, seeing the name Zara I, the Risen Pharaoh, was a trip down memory lane for him. Although, to be fair to them, naming your guild after the infamous ARRR of old WRLD of WCraft did come with some less than stellar connotations. Vale was so lost in his own little world, that he failed to notice the cloud of dust and sand particles kicked into the air a little bit away from the outskirts of the village. In fact, he also failed to notice that there were still a few sand elves left alive that had regrouped and were returning to the village to try and take him on. Some would say that he should have killed them all when he had the chance, but it would turn out that Vale's choice to allow some of the desert elves to flee was the right one, whether he knew it at the time or not. Two opposing forces were converging on the unnamed village, with Vale and the child caught in the middle. But would either side be prepared for what was to come? Probably not. But what else could you expect when seeing how things have gone so far? Quickly, men! Shouted a man whose body looked like it had not only seen better days, but also that it had endured the laborious process of high-class Egyptian mummification, but with some slight alterations. Even a blind man could see that they are in trouble. Drive yourselves harder and faster, lest we not reach them in time. The mummified military man stood tall atop a chariot pulled by steeds equally as shriveled as himself. Yet, despite the fact that they were not only dead but also shriveled up, the undead horses pulled the commoner-born general's chariot faster than any living horse could hope to. The mummy of a man leading a legion of cavalry was the one responsible for guiding the players in the game to the new area released in the expansion he and his pharaoh were introduced in. His name was Ratams, and he was not the type to let death stop him from serving his god queen. He knew full well who and what was responsible for the column of blackish smoke rising just ahead, and he had pardon the undeath pun, bone to pick with the bastards who had, up till now, run roughshod over the innocents he was sworn to protect. He urged his mixture of living and undead subordinates on towards the village, not knowing that he would meet the man who changed his life oh so long ago, and that said man would not be the only one that would greet him. A broken bar. What useless sacks of soiled sand you all are, a broken bar, to think that you cannot take down a single person. A sand elf who looked to be obviously more important than the others led a mixture of his own smaller warband and his kinsmen who had fled from Vale back towards the raised village. He was very disappointed in them, the ones who ran away. Where was their sense of duty and honor? Did they truly think that they could just abandon their task, the one given to them by the greatest of their leaders to ever live, and just walk away intact? No, that was not the case, not by a long shot. After this interloper was put down, he would punish these cowards for daring to abandon the task set upon them by Melach the Great. While he may not be that lofty personage, he would exact punishment on his great ruler's behalf. But, my lord, that thing is just. Shut your damn trap, you cowardly mongrel. I did not give you permission to speak. Know that your dereliction of duty will be met with the shortening of your ears. Wah! But would you prefer to be blinded as well? If not, then cease your yammering and lead the charge. If this white-red monster is as dangerous as you say, maybe you can regain your honor by dying horribly while slowing it down enough for us to kill it ourselves. The remains of the raised village were up ahead, still smoking and still emitting the odor of burning flesh. The warhounds would need something to eat after this, and it made sense to give them the charred meat of the village's former inhabitants. After all, they were, all of them, beneath the great and the mighty desert elf race, and should therefore be happy that their bodies would find a use as sustenance for their pets. The 70 or so desert elves approached the village, completely unaware that the cloud of sand and dust kicked up opposite their path was caused by the cavalry of their mortal foe. A broken bar. Vale stood idle, or rather, he leaned idly up against one of the few walls still left standing in the village, watching over the child he had rescued. She seemed to pay him no mind and just kept offering thanks and other such things to the heavily damaged statue of one of Vale's tamed beings. Boy, if this kid knew what kind of relationship that he and her beloved pharaoh had with each other. A broken bar. Well, perhaps it was indeed better that she did not know that truth. After all, Sometimes ignorance is bliss while also being exactly what you need to keep yourself sane. Please see all Lovecraft-inspired literature and media as to why. Vale was about to find a place to rest a bit, but as his eyes glanced over at the minimap he had neglected to close, he immediately shifted from casual to combat mode. Two forces, one moving at a higher speed than the other, were closing in on this position. While one of them was made up entirely of green dots, which designated allies, the other was formed completely of red dots, which you may correctly assume was a sign of a hostile force. Still, Vale felt it would be best to be cautious, and so he grabbed the little girl and leapt into the burned-out wreck of a house that was still intact enough to act as a decent hideaway. After just over a minute passed, Vale heard shouts coming from opposing entrances to the town square, followed quickly by the barking of dogs, a flurry of various insults from both parties, and finally a dual order to charge forward. It only took a few moments after that for the two lines to collide into each other, resulting in a decent number of casualties on the Sand Elves' side as the bodies of horses and riders, both living and undead, smashed the enemy with the full force of a disciplined cavalry charge. This, however, is where things began to become a quagmire. The rear ranks of the desert Sand Elves released their warhounds, which ignored the forces of their masters and attacked the mix of mummies and living people that had now become bogged down in the melee. Vale peeped out from his hiding spot and realized that he knew one of the mummies in the allied cavalry, General Ratums. "Look out!" Before Vale could intervene, the little girl cried out to the mummy Vale had recognized, who did the wrong thing by looking over to Vale and the child. This gave a warhound the opportunity it needed to leap up and try and rip off the left arm of the mummified general, but as Vale had suspected, Ratums had not spent his time in the New World idling around. No, it seemed that Vale's mix of P-Man-esque training during the life cycle of the game combined with Ratum's own training and duties after the New World became a thing had turned the formerly squishy guide of an NPC into a battle-hardened warrior the likes of which would make someone like Lubu look like a mewling infant. The dog bit down on his left forearm, but Ratums merely sheathed his sword and ripped the upper portion of the dog's skull off, allowing the lower jaw and the rest of the hound's body to go slack and fall to the ground. Drawing his sword once again, the mummy of a military man jumped off of his chariot and began to hack his way through the Sand Elves and their warhounds that were causing so much havoc. Vale took this as his chance, and after making sure that the child he was guarding was safely contained and protected within a barrier, joined in on the brawl that was making the village square all the more akin to a scene out of a partially realistic fantasy battle. With Vale's addition to the side of the foes of the Desert Elves, the battle immediately shifted against the marauders. By the time the sun began to set beneath the horizon, there was not a single one of the Sand Elves or their forces left alive, be they man or beast. Ratum surveyed the scene before him. The village was lost and had been long before he and his forces had arrived. Yet another victim of the one-sided aggression from the Desert Elves had been piled up at their feet, and yet more innocent blood tainted their unjust hands. By now, Ratums was beyond feeling any kind of good emotion for the Sand Elves, and nothing but a burning fire of hatred and wrath filled his undead eyes whenever he gazed upon one of the damned bastards who were responsible for such tragedies. However, there were two bright spots of hope among the ashes and ruins of this once vibrant village. A single young child and a man whose deeds were the stuff of legends and fable remained among the razed settlement, and the latter had aided Ratum's forces in retaking this place. This man was, in Ratum's eyes, almost certainly going to be almost solely responsible for the salvation of the Solution Dominion and that of its immortal pharaoh. Were it not for him, not only would his cherished ruler be either dead or still under the control of that infernal mage, but he himself would never have been reunited with his master, let alone been able to receive a pardon from her and be given the right to command her forces once again. Lord Vale was truly a gift from the sun, and he was a being that his God Queen desired to be at her side. Some people from the Dominion had viewed the epics of his legacy as mere myth, but Ratums knew differently. Unlike those who believed he was either a fairy tale or a divine warrior of the pharaoh, Ratums had seen firsthand the power that Lord Vale could display. If it were not for him, Ratums and his pharaoh, Zara would not be nearly as powerful as they were now. So, here he was, seemingly having arrived in the Dominion's time of need, ready and willing to bring the fight to the desert elves and reclaim more than 10,000 square miles of territory that had been lost to the marauding tribals and, by proxy, to the desert they sought to expand. Ratams knew immediately upon the end of the skirmish what he had to do. His divine master would not be pleased with having to wait for her desired mate to be brought across the vast lands that separated this raised village and her seat of power. No, she would want to see him now and would likely not mind having been called here in the slightest if it meant a reunion with that which some claimed she prized over absolutely everything else. So, as Ratams approached his lord, he withdrew a small fetish from within his clothes and snapped it with his mummified fingers. Immediately, the atmosphere in the destroyed village changed and, in the distance, a piercing light like that of a morning star could be seen rocketing towards the heavens from the direction of the pharaoh's palace. The light pierced through what seemed to be an invisible wall high above the planet, vanishing through it before piercing back through the star-studded barrier and slamming into the ground just meters away from both Ratams and Vale. Before the light had even begun to fade, Ratams, his soldiers and the little child that Vale had protected all got on their knees and bowed low to the being that had used the light of the stars to shift her position from many miles away. The golden glow began to dissipate and a woman who looked like a supermodel cosplaying as a sexy pharaoh seeming formed herself from the fading light, her feet not even touching the ground as she reclined on the body of an overly large king cobra whose black and purple form looked to be covered in stapled-on talismans, burned in hieroglyphs and ringed by the occasional band of what looked to be solid gold that gave the beast a kind of enslaved monster vibe. The woman whose looks would cause many to wonder if a Middle Eastern version of the goddess Aphrodite who had a thing for stereotyped period costume had descended, and as she opened her eyes her piercing gaze swept across those before her. Her gaze first fell on Ratams, her greatest general, and she was about to demand the answer as to why he had called her out here when there was nothing for her to do. Then she felt a sensation unlike anything she had felt in quite a while. It was a feeling that seemed to crawl all over her and set her disembodied heart that had long since been removed from her chest and stored within a canopic jar of flour. She felt the gaze of someone she had vivid memories of piercing her frame from behind, and her monstrously large king cobra ape that doubled as her throne moved around to allow her to see who it was that had such an impact on her. At first, she could only barely remember who it was she was looking at, but as a second turned into two, she realized whom it was that she was looking at. While his attire had changed significantly since their last meeting, she knew now without a shadow of a doubt that this was the one she had waited seemingly an eternity for. Her lips, which bore lipstick the shade of a deep purplish red, trembled as she tried to keep herself from jumping off her living throne and taking Vale in her arms. Despite her desire to do what she wanted, she was the pharaoh and therefore had an image to uphold. However, this did not stop her eyes from watering up and single tear from streaming down her cheek and onto the ground. Upon her tear's contact with the sandy dirt, the ground immediately began to show signs of transforming on a fundamental level. The sandy dirt became moister and more suitable for agriculture as the encroaching desert was forced away until a new super oasis had spread for over 17 miles in all directions from her position. She was barely able to speak at all, but managed to get out barely 4 sentences. "It has been an age since we last beheld each other with our eyes. And now you stand upon my nation and have returned to me in our time of need. Truly, the whims of errant fate work in mysterious ways to bestow upon my struggling nation the one who was prophesied to bring our return to glory at such a time. I, Pharaoh Zara, welcome you, O great and beloved savior of mine, to the Solution Dominion. Broken-Bar, am pleased to have you on my side once again, to save me and mine from the forces of evil and darkness one more time." Vale took in the words of Zara. Even without his prior experience with the other tamed beings he had come into contact with, Vale could tell that there was a certain kind of affection within her eyes. That gaze was one filled with zealotry, fanaticism and no small amount of lust, and Vale sighed inside his head as he realized that once again he would almost certainly have to eventually run for the hills, either to escape the clutches of the raid boss turned Fang Earl that stood before him, or to escape the crazy rat ladies who were almost certain to find him yet again. Still, perhaps Zara wasn't as much of a threat as those Yandere rat monsters had been. Vale subtly checked her level and a broken bar. Vale closed his eyes and sighed, this time quite audibly. He should have guessed that the supposed God Queen of the Solution Dominion would have, just like the five-clawed paw, broken past the maximum game level cap. Unlike Savalt or the Beastman, she was an undead, and therefore did not have to worry about things like aging, illness, or even death itself for the most part. Add in the fact that she was, at least in the game, a rare instance of an undead who could use healing, light and other holy type magics, and you had a being that was, in this new world, more than capable of going past the limits of what was possible in the game. Vale could not even see what her level was, as it was, to his eyes, obscured by question marks. These symbols designated a creature, entity or potential foe that was at the very least 50 levels above the viewer's own. Also, since Vale could only guess how much time had actually passed between when the game was supposed to end, when the new world began, and when he was summoned from the game into the castle of Puke Princess, he figured that Zara's level would be at least over 500 to 700 levels higher than his own. "My dear, what troubles you?" Zara's voice sounded like that of a first-rate female voice actress filling the role of a seductress. Vale was, thankfully, mostly unaffected by this, but he checked his status anyways just to make sure. "Zara?" Vale asked. "Yes, my love?" the pharaoh replied. "Why are you applying a passive charm spell to your words?" "A broken bar." Zara scolded herself inside her head. She did not expect that her lovely Vale would have noticed the subliminal enchantment that she had been trying to apply to him. This was an annoyance, but not entirely beyond the bounds of her predictions. She had intentionally leveled herself up to the point she was at in a desperate bid to make sure that she would have the power needed to ensure that when her Vale appeared before her, she would be able to swing him into her corner with absolute certainty. Perhaps the smarter thing to do would have been to layer on seemingly insignificant stacks of her charm, slowly building a force that would turn her Vale into someone who would wish to be hers and hers alone. By the time those stacks would have worn off, Vale's mind, body and soul would belong to her only, thus giving her nearly complete control over the other factions formed by Vale's servants and allies that had risen from the chaos of the world shift. With them beneath her, she could have easily— "No!" she screamed in her head, banishing that train of thought once again. She had trodden down that dark road uncountable times before, the holdovers from when her pet and living, mobile throne had seized her soul in its grasp. Damn him to the depths of abyss. It was no thanks to that foul bastard's trickery that she had to constantly fight the encroaching influence of the darker side of herself that had been unleashed during that shameful time. Worse yet, the shadow within herself had subconsciously applied a charm spell to her beloved, which made their reunion get off to a shaky start. "Urga broken bar," she moaned aloud. "Forgive me, my heart and soul, my one and only, for that transgression. I have reasons as to why that happened, but the explanation is best saved for another time and another place." "Really?" Vale asked. It was the tone of his voice that caused Zara to curse her weakness even further. Vale obviously had lost faith in her, and there would be no way in Abyss that he would agree to. "My Lord Vale, a word if you will." Zara heard her greatest and most loyal servant speak up from behind her. She turned her head slightly to peek over her shoulder, but her headdress and hair got in the way of her vision and she could not see Ratums very well. "Go on," Vale said, almost certainly doubting that Ratums had anything good to say. "My pharaoh, please forgive me for what I must tell Lord Vale, but it concerns us all and it would be best not to keep him in the dark about the broken bar." "Curse broken bar that you suffer from." "Curse?" Vale asked. "Yes, my lord. It is due to the incident that you rescued her from in ages past, after which she has regained much of her powers and sanity that were once claimed by the damnable mage who enslaved her to his will. After the event we refer to as the world shift, she was fully unshackled and her mind, body and soul were purified. However, there remains a trace of the twisted darkness that the evil sorcerer infused her with that was left behind within her. It is a curse that cannot be broken, not without her final death. In essence, she is constantly forced to battle the lurking shadow that was forced inside of her, and even a slight moment's lack of control can lead to that shadow encroaching upon her thoughts and will. Zara jumped for joy inside her head while also being heavily embarrassed by the words spoken by Repulsive. She had no desire to let Vale know about this internal weakness, but Repulsive had revealed it in a way that painted her as a tragic heroine, fighting a desperate uphill battle against the remnants of an evil thought long since destroyed. How would Vale respond to this? Vale nodded to Repulsive's words, which gave Zara hope that maybe, just maybe, Vale would find it in his heart to forgive her. Understandable. We all have to fight the devil on our shoulder from time to time, and I can only imagine what kind of charismatic bastard of a devil you have on your shoulder, Zara. Let's just try and avoid stuff like this in the future, as I already have at least 5 people who have given in to the darker side of their love for me and want me locked up and used as a stud horse. I would prefer not to have to add you to the list of things I have to keep running away from in order to keep my freedom. At Vale's words, Zara nearly sang for joy while gripping her Vale in the tightest hug she had ever given. Elated that Vale chose to not just run away from her or even disown her, Zara began channeling her awesome power into a spell. Then, "Please, let me take you from this place," she said with an uncommon smile on her face. "I have so much to show you, my dear." Yes, so much indeed. A little over 1 week prior to Vale meeting Repulsive and Zara, the Pharaoh herself was enjoying herself in one of the few moments of alone time she had. Although, truth be told, she wasn't exactly alone in the fullest sense of the word. There was another sapient being in the room with her, and she was deriving no small amount of pleasure from the suffering of the being's mind and soul. During the totality of the desert elf invasion that had been going on for who knows how long, Zara had been unable to go directly to the front and fight off the sand elves herself. Those damnable bastards had some kind of ward that they kept putting up wherever they went, slowly isolating her and her influence from more and more of her lands. This had made her very unhappy, and this time alone to herself and her victim was one of the few ways she could vent her frustrations. She enjoyed the suffering of the creature that was before her. A long, long time ago in a place far, far away from her current domain, this mongrel had done something to herself and her nation that had left a lasting and festering wound on her mind and soul, to say nothing of what the creature had done to her body. She hated every minute that she was under that foul bastard's control, and she had felt the darkness that he had used to manipulate her, slowly tainting her bit by bit. Now, the puppet master had become the puppet, and the slave had become the master. The foul mage that had deceived her so was now trapped inside the body of an emperor cobra, Neon Genesis Phantasia's monster equivalent of the Sci-Fi Channel movie version of an upsized king cobra. Oh, how she had enjoyed stuffing that mad mage's mind and soul into his current prison. The agony that wafted off of his form was music to her ears. She would never, ever let him go, not now and not ever. He would serve her as a mobile seat until his current body gave out and she had to stuff his mind and soul in another one. She had been doing this for centuries up till this point, so she had the process down to pat. Now that the current Emperor Cobra's life was at its natural end, she began to initiate the ritual of transference to force the already heavily addled mind and soul of her former master into a new body. This would further increase the burden placed upon the sorcerer's existence, and Zara estimated that she either had another 2 times to do this whole song and dance or that she had to find something else to stick the bastard into. It was then when the realization hit her. Of course, it was so simple that she couldn't figure out why she had not thought of it earlier. She switched the wording of her ritual ever so slightly, and the older, previous shell that the dark wizard had been stuffed into fell to the ground, its life having left it at last. The crystal that acted as the link between the 2 ritual circles began to glow an even brighter shade of red than it had all the times that she had used the original ritual, and by the end of her experiment the other Emperor Cobra had also collapsed to the floor. However, her experiment had succeeded. The crystal now contained the Mad Mage's soul, and she knew just where to put it. A broken bar. No more. I'm sorry. 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 A broken bar. The will trapped within its crystal prison would have taken a fetal position while crying and rocking back and forth if it could. It had endured suffering beyond the scope of what a human mind could deal with and was, by this point, effectively broken. It sobbed its apologies over and over, but the person it had wronged in its original life had no mercy for it. All that was left when the pharaoh looked at it was contempt, hatred, and rage. At the very least, in public it had been treated like a disobedient pet owned by a rather harsh master, but in private it was a whole different story. Now it was held within a red crystal, and its odds of survival were diminishing by the second. Please, just end it. I'm sorry. No more. Make the pain go away, I beg you. The femme fatale pharaoh seemed to have heard the mournful cries of it, but when she looked down towards it the risen dead ruler merely whispered no, and moved on. A broken bar. She had never intended to open this Pandora's box, but if her estimates were correct, then she had the perfect opportunity to deal with two birds using just one stone. Locked away, deep beneath her palace, was a beast powerful enough to even give herself pause. During its heyday, the monster called Eclipse Apophis had effectively forced Zara to split her domain in two. One half was hers, and the other was owned and terrorized by the massive purple and black cobra that was now imprisoned behind this last door. More than a century had passed since she had cemented her status as a god in the eyes of the people that she ruled over by forcing the Eclipse Apophis to yield, and now the beast was starved and weak. She initially intended to kill it, but now she had a way to make the mad mage suffer eternally, all while she could make the nightmare that was her old foe stay beneath her forever after. Wake up, you dumbass overgrown legless reptilian bastard! She yelled, rousing the withered monster from its starvation-induced slumber. She did not wait around for the beast to do much else and began her new ritual. A broken bar. Should we be concerned, Ramses? Number. She went in there for a reason and she will leave when she is ready. But that is the room that holds the... Yes, but she was the one to best it in the first place. She likely entered to put the creature out of its misery, or perhaps to force it to serve her. Okay. But, hush, she is emerging. The two guards stood at attention, as the massive doors opened again and an emperor cobra whose scales were a mixture of black and purple slithered out from the prison, the pharaoh reclining upon its head. The serpent's body had numerous talismans fused into its flesh while gold bands gripped the frame of the creature tightly and hieroglyphs burned into its scaled form dotted the monstrous serpent's being. Beyond all of it, there looked to be a place where the flesh on the snake's head had been peeled away and there seemed to be evidence that something had been placed inside its skull in lieu of its brain. Zara smiled with non-malicious joy for the first time in quite a while as she rode her newest tape down the halls to reach her throne room. Things were looking up, and now she had more time to spend trying to direct her forces to drive back the invaders. She had done what she wanted to and had neutered two snakes with one move. Veil was lifted by the tail of the giant purple and black king cobra and placed alongside Zara on its back. Then, with a snap of her fingers, the two people and one snake went a broken bar. Nowhere. Veil was the only one of the three most important people in the area to be confused by this turn of events. And when he looked at Zara's face, which was contorted in anger, he figured something must have gone horribly wrong. Zara, what is going on? Veil asked, trying not to set off the entity that was far, far stronger than he could ever hope to be. Zara did not answer him and instead looked towards the limits of her domain, past where her single tear had changed the furthest bit of terrain from sandy desert to arable soil. My pharaoh, perhaps we could ask Lord Veil for assistance with this matter? Ratams asked in a respectful but sort of raspy voice fit for a mummified general. All of our other options have failed to bear fruit, and we are grasping at straws at this point. If Lord Veil arrived here through the desert, then he must have passed through the boundaries of at least one of those things. That would indicate that he is unaffected by them. Unlike ourselves, he may just be our best hope at pushing back the encroaching invaders and retaking the territory that they have stolen from you. Veil shifted his gaze between Ratams and Zara, hoping one of them would further elaborate on the problem that they were facing. But Zara seemed determined to avoid talking about whatever issue that Ratams had mentioned. This left Vale with little choice but to bite the bullet and pop the question himself. Zara, tell me what is keeping you and your nation in such a tight spot? What could possibly overpower the will of something like yourself? Despite the time that has passed, you are still my tamed being, and if I can help you, I will. There is no need to be ashamed, as not every problem can be solved without outside intervention. I guess that's why fate led me here, then to help you in your time of need. What is the issue? Zara tried to keep from looking at Vale, but Vale was not having any of that. To the quiet amusement of the Solution cavalry, both living and undead, Vale began to toy with Zara's hair, her jewelry and the other bits and baubles on her person like an autistic preteen who had only the vaguest concept of personal boundaries. The pharaoh tried to ignore Vale, but the master Tamer was relentless. Finally, Zara yielded just as Vale began to flap her headdress like a bird's wings. Enough. Fine, you win. I will tell you what you want to know, so please just stop that. Vale smiled beneath his mask and let go of Zara's headgear. A winner is me, he said, relishing his minor victory. Zara composed herself and then turned to face Vale. The invading sand elves, desert elves. Vale corrected. They use the terms interchangeably. As I was saying, the sand elves have been slowly pushing my nation further and further from its old borders. Somehow, they have acquired a number of devices that project a field that renders my powers useless and keeps my soldiers from using much of theirs as well. They move these devices forwards, slowly tightening the noose, and to make matters worse, I cannot even contact the other members of the Alliance and request their aid. The barrier they have created is always moved forwards after the nearest settlements have been raised, almost like they want us to put up a decent fight before denying us anything in the way of a rapid counterattack. We were lucky that not only were my cavalry, led by General Ratams over there, in the area, but also that they had not moved up the device in time to deter us from retaking this place. Now, however, a broken bar. Vale held up his hand as if to stop her. Point me towards the target. All you need is for the area denial devices to be destroyed, right? I seem to be unaffected, so allow me to deal with them. I may not be as powerful as you are now, but I've still got more than a few cards up my sleeve. Sometimes quite literally. Zara shook her head in response. I cannot risk you suffering a terrible fate at their hands. Besides, those scouts that managed to see the devices all report that they are guarded by no small number of the Sand Elves' most elite warriors. They will fight you to the death to keep you away from the devices, and I am unwilling to risk your life in such an endeavor. Vale nodded at Zara's words, and then turned to Ratams. Which way do I need to go? Zara glared daggers at Ratams, trying to intimidate him into silence. Unfortunately for her, Ratams was more than willing to do anything needed to protect not only his pharaoh but also the Solution Dominion. He also had a better understanding of the strength Vale possessed in comparison to the desert Sand Elves. Pharaoh Zara I had spent most of her time in the New World residing in a palace staffed by people whose average level exceeded 300, which was an almost unheard of and absurdly high number compared to the rest of the people and creatures on the planet. Vale's level was, by now, 3 levels higher than it had been last he had checked, meaning Vale had exceeded the in-game maximum level. Even without this, he had the power to dispose of the invaders and their device on his own. Besides, Ratams knew well how Vale operated when faced with the risk of true danger. During the time before the world shift, he had heard of Vale's exploits from no small number of other Outworlders. When faced with absolute danger, Vale did not bumble in and loudly announce his presence. If he did so, it would cost him his shot at getting his hands on what the Outworlders called a special mobs. Vale, when faced with a danger that was potentially life-threatening, would either flee or simply manage to be both out of sight and out of mind. Ratams had full faith that if Vale could not Sam Fisher his way in and out, he could certainly overpower the guards and solve the problem the way only a person exponentially stronger than their opponent could hope to. Ratams made his decision, and pointed his shriveled finger towards the distant dunes, and without a word Vale hopped off the pharaoh's mount and ran full speed in the direction that Ratams had pointed. much to the dismay of Zara. "I'll have your head for this if he dies," she screamed, almost certainly willing to back up such words with action. "That will only happen if I don't kill myself first. But, please, have faith. He will succeed, and of that I am sure." Vale continued to run until he hit the sand that had become the effective border between the recently retaken ruin of a village and the lands that had been claimed by the desert, sand elves. Once he reached said mass of sand, he slowed his movement through the sun-baked desert to a fraction of what it once was. After all, trying to run in sand was best left to those best suited to the task, and his human feet would just sink ever deeper with every thunderous footfall that he leveled against the terrain. He was in the business of reaching and destroying the object that was jamming Zara's power and influence, not kicking up huge quantities of sediment as he went, revealing his position and his intent to anyone with a lick of sense. And it was due to this that his normally absurd speed became what to him was a slow crawl across the dunes. By the time he eventually set his eyes upon the encampment of the invading sand people, the day had completely given way to night and the stars and moon hung overhead, giving the dark and almost otherworldly feel to the man who, on Earth, had never seen a night sky that was not dulled by the mass of lights from all of civilization. Even the moon looked bigger, brighter and more beautiful, but Vale caught himself before fully giving in and wasting time to appreciate nature. He had a job that he had set himself to, and wasting time looking at the brilliant skybox was not a vital part of it. He surveyed the camp before him from his vantage point on the top of a dune more than 9/8 of a kilometer away, well out of sight and out of range of the pitifully underleveled idiot's ability to even notice him. He had noticed that the overall level of most members of the races were dismal compared to what he felt they should have been, but it eventually dawned on him why that was the case. Unless you had a whole lot of luck or an absurd amount of money, resources, you could only live once. These people were, ultimately, leveled far, far higher compared to those who were the civilians. After all, when your base stats are lower than that of most foes, simply surviving long enough to get to level 30 was a huge achievement in and of itself. These people didn't have the near infinite continues of a player, and if they died that was it. There was no revival procedure in place at all for them. It almost made Vale feel bad for killing them and ruining their nations. Almost, but not quite. Vale didn't have the time or patience to care much for those who sought to do wrong by him and his, so he brushed his insignificantly minuscule sense of admiration for their tenacity aside and got to work. A broken bar maker of the red sands stood outside one of the entrances to the camp, his eyes peering into the darkness just beyond the light of the lit torches that gave him a bit more visibility during the cold and bitter time he was forced to stand watch in. He had been at this post for quite a while now, and he was still waiting for one of two things to happen, either of which would be a reason for him to celebrate. He was also here as a lookout in case there was an attack, but that was not one of the two main reasons he was here. His objectives, as given to him by his tribal chief, were to hold position until either the warband sent to scour the nearest enemy village returned or until he was relieved of his post at word of the same chief that placed him here. He had been here at this same spot for over 12 hours, with only the occasional meal and bathroom break allowing him to move from his post. At least he had been given some shade and a copious amount of water. If not for that he likely would have keeled over due to heat exhaustion. His kind were rather resistant to the heat and lack of food and drink that their home continuously treated them to, but they were not immune to heat, hunger, thirst and exhaustion. Thus, he was nearly about to nod off into sleep when he heard the sound of a footstep in the sand in front of him. Immediately, his eyes opened wide and he leapt to his feet, his spear at the ready, but there was not a soul in sight. Just as he was about to chastise himself for his overactive imagination, he swore he could hear a second footstep in the sand, this time just a few yards to his right. He wheeled around, but once again there was nobody there. This convinced him that either one of two things were going on. Either he was hearing the footsteps of an enemy agent, or he was so damn tired that his brain was playing tricks on him. He waited a bit longer, fully exposing his long and pointed ears to the world around him and strained his senses to their limit. 10 seconds passed, then 30, then a minute. The sound he had heard did not repeat itself, unless of course it had fully passed by him and into the camp, at which point it would be impossible to track unless everyone inside stayed perfectly still and made no noise. Maker of the Red Sands sighed and looked over to the board that was behind his spot. The schedule written on it clearly stated that he should have been relieved 5 hours ago, but not a soul had come up to do so. At best they had dropped off some food and water, but nothing else. He looked back from the board to the open entrance that he was guarding and then stabbed his spear into the ground. You know what? It's not my fucking problem anymore. With that, the guard sat down in his seat and decided to take the train to Sleepy Time Junction, leaving Vale to steal away through the camp, dodging bodies as he made his way deeper into the gathering of nomadic peoples and towards the large and completely foreign-looking object that was placed upon a mobile platform in the center of the base. What I wouldn't give for the ultimate technology in regards to infiltration, a broken bar, Vale muttered inside his head as he pined for a mystical cardboard box for him to use to make his sneaking that much more fun. Still, it's probably not something I actually need, considering these assholes seem utterly unaware that I am here. Yes, being a max-level player had its perks, one of which was the fact that said players all had at least one way to avoid being seen by low-leveled players. The in-game explanation was that the lowly fools who were just barely starting on their path to glory would be unable to comprehend the power that they were witnessing strut about around them. The out-of-game explanation was that, in order to avoid griefers targeting low-leveled players and NPCs, there was a barrier put in place to make sure that the noobs could have fun without having their shit wrecked by more powerful players. Basically, what it boiled down to was that high-level players could not target anything that was not actively hostile or marked as an enemy by the game when it was severely beneath their level, and this included NPCs. Thankfully, it seemed that in this new world, the rules regarding high, low-level interactions were a broken bar slightly altered. Vale had, only recently, noticed that the tab to switch himself from visible to all to only being visible to allies and other high-level entities was set to show him to everyone, and this infiltration would have been a lot more violent had he not flipped that switch earlier. He had to admit, it felt weird as fuck to have other people and animals just walk through him like he was some kind of ghost that no one could see, and the sight of people's insides being visible for just a brief moment as they passed through him was certainly enough to cause him some discomfort. Still, despite these things, the fact remained that he was almost into the clearing that housed the large, utterly foreign object that seemed to be the root cause of Zara's influence being pushed back. Once he set his eyes on it up close, he felt something he had not felt in quite a while. Fear. Not the normal kind of fear either. No, this was a kind of fear that caused grown men who had seen the worst shit the universe had to offer shit themselves and run screaming. It was exuding a kind of existential dread that Vale had only experienced a handful of times before. Once was when he had first dived into VR gaming and witnessed how the entire whole of what he had thought reality was could effectively have been a masterful simulation that he had no idea if he was in or not. The second was when he played the full-dive virtual reality version of the old TTRPG A Call of Cthulhu and ended up facing down a Lovecraftian deity, ultimately having his character die then and there out of madness and fear. And then there was that time he saw Cho devour a whole metric fuckton of rat-ant souls like she was chugging beer from a tube at a party. A broken bar. Yeah, those were bad, but these a broken bar trumped them all. It looked to be a twisted mixture of modern Earth technology and stuff from the game, but Vale could not pin down what belonged from where and where each piece of the horrifying object actually was. The whole thing reeked of malicious interference from some otherworldly, by the New World standards, powers beyond the capabilities of anything Vale could think to fathom. Half expecting to find his task impossible, Vale hesitantly checked the HP and level of the object. The name of the device was utterly incomprehensible, appearing as a mishmash of various letters, symbols, numerals, shapes and other random stuff all overlapping to form something that would give a cryptographer a migraine, but at least its level and HP were dismally low. Vale took a few steps back, passing through the body of a guard and then made a running jump towards the object. Both of his feet made contact at the same time, and the object shattered like glass before its components glitched out and vanished from reality. It was at the same time that the object shattered that a deafening screech similar to nails on a chalkboard combined with metal shearing echoed out across the dunes, emanating from the now destroyed device. Vale's ears were still ringing as he picked himself up and looked around, only to see the desert. Sand elves that he had snuck past were writhing on the sand with blood trickling out of their eyes, ears and noses. That wasn't all, however, as a short bit later, one of them rose to his feet and charged at Vale, pointing his spear directly at the player's left side. Vale was at first going to just move aside and kill the bastard, but he had an idea that was rather dangerous that he wanted to try out. Call it a risky experiment, but Vale wanted to see just how much damage he would take from such an attack. He had not experienced the danger of a low-leveled entity since the dwarf tried to stab him to death, and he needed to remember exactly how it felt. Being completely uninjured and untouchable for so long made him question how durable he was, and this was a perfect opportunity to. The sharp feeling of pain flooded him from the rear of his right shoulder. He quickly wheeled around and leveled a fist straight into the face so far broken by something. It took him a while to comprehend what he had just punched his hand through, but he then realized that this was the same kind of creature that had tried to stop him from investigating the death, or possible deletion, of the former prince of the best Hyrule kingdom. Cursing himself for his carelessness, Vale decided that it may not be the best idea to stick around and tried to bolt for it. Before he could, however, the dunes began to shake and the sand beneath his feet began to shift. "What the flying goddamned fuck is it now?" Vale exclaimed, only to have his feel slip out from under him as a massive creature formed of stone and metal emerged from beneath his feet and began attacking the desert sand elves. It appeared as though the cavalry had arrived, all at the will of the being whose returned influence over the area now guided the formerly sleeping stone and metal monstrosities in their pursuit of the enemies of their master. Melak the Great sat out beyond the confines of his tent, his eyes glued upwards towards the heavens. He did not speak a word, nor did he make a single sound beyond his quiet breathing, and if you were not aware as to what he was actually doing you might have thought that he was stargazing. This, however, would not be further from the truth. He looked up to the night sky, covered in stars that twinkled as they stood alongside the brilliant full moon, and cursed himself and his foolishness. He was guilty of one crime over all others, a crime worse than the murder, rape, vandalism, torture and other unspeakable acts that he had committed against the Solution Dominion and its people. That sin was the sin of simply knowing too much. He had been a fool to leave his tribe during his youth to go on a grand adventure to discover the people and places of the world and take from them what he could. He had been a fool to believe that the old madmen that he had slaughtered were protecting trinkets and baubles that were only rumored to be cursed. He had been a fool to place upon his body those objects, for when he placed them upon his form his eyes were open to an unspeakable truth, and they could never be blind to it ever again. He knew what the stars and moon truly were, as he also knew what the sun that his people worshipped was as well. But he was not foolish enough to divulge such information to his people. He had a great many experiences where the assassins sent by the being that he referred to as the true ruler made attempts on his life. These assassins were potent, and what was worse was that only their target could see or sense them. They would attack at random and, more often than not, very inopportune times and move to kill, regarding their own bodies as expendable in the extreme. He had been able to hold his own for a while, but then in his sleep the true ruler contacted him. He was unable to withstand the power of the entity that was now the one who held the noose around his neck, and he had no other option but to become a semi-willing servant of this powerful and unspeakable being. This being that called itself Thwodun opened his eyes to the truth of reality, and this was what ultimately tipped Melak over into his new persona. Through the awakening he had been given, he realized that a new threat was about to be unleashed upon the world, a foe that could quite possibly be the end of his people. Thus, he petitioned his new god for aid, and the aid he received was both great and terrible. A subliminal power, sourced from the true god of this world, surged out from within him and washed over all the tribes of his people. With that surge coinciding with the broader and more widely felt one from one of the human kingdoms, Melach's general personality subsumed that of almost the whole of his people without any person being any the wiser. They were now bound to his will, at least until he died, but while they now shared his views on their old foe, they were still mostly independent. This would change when the second of his new god's gifts was delivered to his doorstep by the same impossible assassins that had tried to kill him many times before. These broken bar objects were unholy creations that tore at the minds of all that beheld them, and not even Melach was immune to this fact. Now, as he gazed up at the fake night sky, he once again came to terms with a simple and undeniable truth. He and his people were slowly but surely becoming nothing more than puppets for the true God of this damned world to toy with as it liked. He had already felt his will occasionally slacking and the blind antagonistic malice towards the Solution dominion possessed by his God take over. In fact, it was becoming more and more common for him to find entire hours or even days of his life missing from his memories. He would wake up, black out, and suddenly be surrounded by the dead bodies of people he was raised to hate. And, oddly enough, he was liking it. These objects were letting him and his people claim what was rightfully theirs, and his eyes being opened made him realize just how little his victims truly mattered in the grand scheme of things. He no longer needed to care for his own people either. Why spare the slightest bit of sympathy for a mere doll that could be erased at any given moment by a being more inclined to keep the world stable than care even the smallest bit for those that served it? He was about to call it a night when his god's voice screamed at him in its otherworldly tongue. He could not understand the words, but he could easily understand the meaning of the high-pitched screeching noise that a certain other person would call a mix of binary and the old 90s era AOL online internet connection sound. Someone had destroyed one of the objects. Someone had given the enemy the room to move that he was trying to remove. Melach rose to his feet and turned his head off towards the distance. His rhinolont, think an ungodly fusion between an ankylosaurus, a rhino, a camel and an African elephant, would take him directly to the place where that foe stood, and he would use his God-given might to smash that interloper to bits. Mounting up, the master of the desert peoples beckoned his fellows to follow him into battle. They would travel through the night to reach their foe, but they would be far from prepared to meet it if they did not use a more sinister means to deal with it. Melach sent a subliminal command out to his people, and they acted upon it. The objects they had with them were being moved, and once they had been repositioned the fool would be caught in overlapping areas of effect. What strength it had mustered up till that point would be stripped from it, and then a broken bar. Then Melach would dedicate the bastard's soul to his god before ending the mongrel's life. Then and there, chaos. That was the most basic description of what Vale was seeing in the desert, sand elf encampment. The numerous constructs that had long since been buried by the flow of time and the movement of the sands were rising up from their graves one by one, as they exhumed themselves from the silt and dust. They locked onto their targets and almost immediately set to work smashing, crushing, cleaving, squishing, cutting, stabbing and mutilating their opponents in all manner of other ways. The servants of Melach the Great, cruel, were still recovering from the mental impact that the destruction of the unknown object had caused, and they were in no real position to deal with the rapidly growing army of stone and metal creatures that seemed to endlessly unbury themselves, one after the other, before then deciding to make war upon them. At the very least, Vale had not actively joined the fray, and simply watched the carnage that unfolded before him. On his minimap, the red dots vanished one by one, each overcome by at least one green dot before said entity moved on to attack another foe. Vale was awestruck by the brutality that was on display here. The constructs were not just attacking the men, but also the women and the children too. Vale could see now that the darkness that the nameless sorcerer had infused within Zara had risen to the top and was now puppeteering the mostly stone pseudo-golems like it was playing a real-time strategy game. He almost wanted to get involved and end the fighting, but some part of him held him back even as he saw a pregnant sand elf woman get skewered through her back and out through her stomach by the tail of a half-school bus-sized black scorpion, made almost entirely of some kind of magically enhanced obsidian-like material, before being thrown into the air and then swatted to the ground like a fly by an even larger humanoid construct. Just as Vale decided that he could leave the pseudo-golems to do their thing, they began to collapse to the ground. Vale could feel that something was not right, and so he stepped up onto one of the now motionless stony beings and used the full extent of his powers as a player to jump high into the air. This jump did fracture a bit of the large dog-like stone puppet, but that was a small price to pay for him getting a better view. As he reached the apex of his short flight, Vale's eyes saw the faint outline of several more of the odd objects a fair bit away. He also saw that they were being moved closer to the camp that he had just jumped from, and the pieces in his mind all came together. As he began to fall, he activated a bound ability in one of his shoes, which kept him in the air just around 30 seconds more before he would be forced to slowly drift back to the surface. There was no time like the present for him to act, and he rifled through his inventory for a while before withdrawing a couple lumps of unrefined iron ore. He still had around 5 seconds left to hover by now, and that was all he needed. Lobbing those roughly cantaloupe-sized lumps of iron ore like a Major League Baseball pitcher, Vale let fly 6 individual clumps of ore at speeds just low enough to avoid the material heating up far too much to be of much use but just fast enough to, hopefully, smash the strange objects that the desert elves were moving. All but 2 of the lumps struck true, with one missing its target by around half a meter and the other missing its intended target but at least doing some good, smashing some random sand elf to a bloody mess on impact before bouncing off the sand and removing another fool's leg just above the knee. Vale soon began to float gently towards the ruined encampment beneath him, but this just gave him slightly more time to throw a few more fastballs. After making another 4 throws, this time hitting his target on the first and 4th throw respectively, Vale decided to be even more of a dick to the enemy of his ally by throwing a few more broken bar dangerous things at the desert elves. He still had quite the number of bottles filled with all manner of concoctions in his expansive inventory, all gathered at some point or another during his playtime but never used due to either him not finding a good place, time to use them, or getting better stuff and retiring the older, weaker mixture before it could be used. However, now he was not facing high-level players, but instead a bunch of level 30-40 mooks. By the almighty power of the inverse ninja law, he had more than enough stuff to take the very bad day that these people were having and make it far, far worse. However, Vale failed to notice during this time that a group of sand elves riding monsters that they had tamed were approaching from behind a rather large dune. By the time he had finally touched down on terra firma, however, he was painfully aware of the incoming threat. This was due not to him being actually in danger, but due to the shouts and whoops from the riders of the monstrous mounts as they tried to force their beasts to charge him. Unfortunately for the desert elves, that charge they were planning was never going to happen, as Vale's stupidly effective reversed attractiveness debuff combined with his stupidly good Tamer-focused build made the Rhinalons outright refuse to even attempt to harm him. Eventually, the Sand Elf cavalry decided that dismounting was the best option available to them, and that ended up not going so well for them either. Vale just gave a slight command as the last of the desert elves' feet touched the ground, and suddenly their former mounts were now all lifting up their legs and relieving their bladders all over their owners. Vale nearly wet himself laughing, but he figured that he had better things to do than stick around. Besides, his intention was not to kill everyone, although he certainly could do so. No. He was here just to destroy a few of those twisted objects and then retreat while letting Zara's unrestricted power overwhelm the exposed enemies of herself and her nation. Vale hoofed it back towards the ruined village, letting his control over the Rhinalons slip and allowing the rapidly increasing number of constructs do their thing. He arrived back to safety just as the sun was coming up, and rather than tell anyone he was back, he decided to simply hit the hay in the husk of one of the burned-out houses. He was sure that Zara knew now that he was easily able to deal with the things she couldn't, and with that bit of leverage safely inside his head, he shut his eyes and went to sleep, all while completely unaware that Zara had left this place and arrived at her new destination, looking to fight alongside Vale himself, no less. Just a few moments after he left the camp that had housed the first unknown object that he had destroyed. A broken bar, as Vale caught some much-needed Zeds, Melach had retreated from the destruction that the risen pharaoh was wreaking, cursing himself and his own weakness for being unable to stop from coming to pass the prophetic visions his new god had shown him of what could potentially be. His skin was exposed to the elements and now burned with the fury of what was just under a third-degree sunburn, caused by the magical bolt of solar flame that had incinerated more than a third of his trusted cavalry and left him nearly blind for a few moments. There was now a breach in the containment field, and he dreaded the lecture that his deity would have for him. However, even a disaster such as this could be undone if he put his mind to it. He needed to destroy these people, for even the destruction of even a single member of the Dark Alliance of monsters and men would have drastic ramifications further down the line. The flapping of but an individual dust fly's wings could cause a hurricane after enough time had passed, and he just needed to make the wings flap in just the right place and in just the right way. If he could do that, the end of everything could be averted and the masters of the true God could be preserved. In the few moments after Vale had evacuated the Sand Elves' camp, a pillar of light burst from the sky that had previously been lit solely by flames, stars and the moon. The lance descended upon the exact coordinates where the unidentifiable object had previously stood, landing upon the already scarred sand and melting it to glass. In that briefest of moments before the light faded and its cargo revealed itself, one could almost believe that a star or even the sun itself had fallen from heaven and bestowed its glory and fury upon a small plot of land. However, when that light finally did fade, it revealed not the sun or a star, but a very irate undead monarch who sat upon a massive purple and black-colored emperor cobra that was coiled up to form a chair. She scanned the area with her senses but could not find her master anywhere nearby. She sighed internally, realizing Vale had simply done his job and then scurried back to safety, just like Ratams had figured that he would. She really needed to give her Supreme General more credit. His predictions had been spot on for nearly his entire tenure as her best military mind, and it was high time that she acknowledged his ability. Besides that, she could not stop her more monstrous side from assuming some degree of control. She had felt it when Vale had suffered his injury, and it was almost a perfect certainty that all of the others had noticed that brief moment where their master took damage. She figured that by now the unforgivable transgressor had been killed, but she could not be certain. She needed to find some evidence of the entity responsible, otherwise she felt that she would be held accountable for the damage Vale had taken on. It was around that time that she noticed a single bit of discolored sand not even a few inches from herself. The sand bore a rather crimson color, and while there were many such patches scattered around the place, both big and small, this one in particular caused her anger to build more and more the longer she looked at it. She stared at it for a few moments, the reality of it processing in her head in a way that would have been animated to show a cartoon alarm clock ticking and finally ringing as she realized what, or rather who it was from. With an ungodly roar, Zara called down bolts of magical light from the heavens. The bolts of heat and, effectively, magical plasma, showered the area around herself in a random spread that set the very ground on fire. And yes, dear reader, you can set sand on fire, you just need magic and or some very fancy incendiaries. A broken bar. It was at this moment that Melach the Great, to his own people, otherwise known as Melach the Cruel, to pretty much everyone else, deigned it appropriate to do something both incredibly brave and incredibly stupid. Although, to be fair, he just wanted to stop his people from chain rooting, which was an act that would condemn many more of his kind to death by the Pharaoh's rage and her stone constructs, so he really didn't have many other options available to him. Tossing sanity to the wind, Melach rode his mount directly towards the furious Pharaoh, only for the rest of his elite cavalry bodyguards to follow suit. Before he could bark orders for his people to turn and leave him, a blast of heat and pressure flew past his side. He at first did not know what had happened, but when he realized what had just whistled by him, he immediately was overcome with intense pain. His whole body on that side burned like it had been exposed to the sun for multiple days on end without protection, and one of his eyes was effectively blinded by the light and heat that had assailed it. To make matters worse for him, a not so insubstantial number of his companions were now either on fire, scorched to the bone, or writhing in agony as their mounts suffered the same fate. Melach, for all his bravery, realized that even attempting to get close was suicide, and he refused to let his people shatter back into disparate tribes. They needed his guidance and leadership, so he decided to bite the bullet and turned his mount around and fled. At the sight of their leader simply giving up, the very thing Melach was hoping to avoid transpired. Like a dam bursting, the few men and women who were still fighting broke and scattered in all directions. And, as he predicted would happen, the pharaoh and her force of constructs tore a great many innocent desert elves to bits as they fled. A broken bar. Perhaps if Zara had been in a better state of mind, she would have noticed that the man responsible for so much of her people's suffering was within range of her attacks. Unfortunately for her and her people, but not for all of you since it means more chapters, she was not in such a state and therefore did not really notice when Melach charged at her. No. She lobbed that beam of light, heat and death in his direction merely by instinct, and the moment that Melach fled her darker side began to order her puppets to slaughter any who fought or fled that they could get their mitts on. It was only just after the sun had reached a fourth of its journey through the daytime sky did Zara come down from her fury and, with eyes unclouded by darkness and rage, beheld the bloody carnage that she and her pawns had wrought upon the immediate area of the camps that had suffered the loss of their otherworldly object. Only 2 had been evacuated in time to only lose 50 to 65% of their populace at most. It was a crushing defeat for the Marauders, a massive victory and morale boost for the Solution Dominion, and a Tuesday for Vale. But, more than that, it was the beginning of the end for the combined forces of the desert Sand Elves. That was due to multiple reasons, but one of the key reasons was rather simple. With all the objects in a specific area down, there was now a gap in the blockade that Zara could now expose. She now could call on those loyal to her and, of course, to Vale that made the deserts their home. Even more than that, she was now once again able to contact the other major players in the alliance between Vale's tamed beings and, if needed, call on their assistance. The mutual defense clause still stood, and while no one had ever invoked it, it still remained. Whether the Sand Elves managed to push further or not was irrelevant now, because if Zara felt it needed, she could make sure that everyone was there to fight her foes with her. Vale slept like a baby for a good 12 or so hours in his secluded spot, but he spent a great deal longer asleep in a very different place altogether. Yes, by the time he awoke, Zara had long since calmed down from her rage and located him, then had proceeded to transport him somewhere far from the front lines. Vale was still fully clothed, his mask still stuck to his face and impossible for an outside force to remove, but to Zara that wasn't a problem. She had Vale right where she wanted him, far away from any danger and with his head resting on her lap. If she could only remove that pesky mask and take in his features, then she would never ask for anything of him ever again, with the possible exceptions being a kiss and a child. Vale did eventually wake up from his nearly 24-hour-long slumber, and the moment he opened his eyes they locked with those of Zara. While his mask did obscure his eyes in a similar fashion to a certain comic book detective who had a thing for bats, Zara was seemingly able to determine that yes, he had awoken. As Zara beamed down at him, Vale tried shifting his position, only to discover that his body below his shoulders was trapped between the coils of the giant fucking cobra that Zara had been using as a chair. "Zara, please tell the snake to let me go," Vale asked, but his words were met with a shaking of the pharaoh's head. "I think not. You just run off and try to destroy more of those unfathomable objects, putting yourself in even more unneeded danger. Speaking of which, how is your wound healing?" Vale didn't quite understand what Zara had meant by him having a wound until he remembered the mysterious assassin whose head he had punched in after it had stabbed him in the shoulder. Silently, he pulled up his status sheet and was pleased to discover that the minor damage inflicted upon him had since been perfectly regenerated from. Better still, at least in his eyes, his attire was also undamaged, a thing he had to thank the auto-repair buff he had gotten added into the outfit. This thing he was wearing was damned expensive, and it was likely that the components needed to make and or repair it under normal circumstances no longer existed. He could deal with injuries, but irreversible damage to his favorite clothes. Not much was scarier than that a broken bar. Ah, that a broken bar, Vale answered. The wound I incurred was fully healed, my health pool is back to max and my clothes are undamaged. Besides, I'll be more careful next time. So please. No. Zara's shout drew a few eyes from inside the ornate throne room she and Vale were in. Vale himself couldn't get a good look due to the body of the snake and that of Zara herself obscuring all but a fraction of his view, but what he did see made him wonder slightly if Zara had indeed been thinking only of her people. From what little was visible to him, Vale could see that this place was swanky at a minimum and absolutely and overwhelmingly ostentatious at a maximum. Zara seemed to pick up on this, and after she calmed down from her one-word declaration of refusal, she told Vale the truth. You are wondering if I demanded this grandiose marvel that is my palace from my people. Yes, I did not. I was content to rule in a place far less flamboyant than. She moved her arm to gesture to the area in its entirety. This. But as my nation grew, so did the love my people had for me. I solved crisis after crisis, ended hunger, thirst, homelessness, joblessness and wiped away so many illnesses, physical, mental, and national. Was it any wonder then that they, after seeing that I wanted to do naught but help them become something greater than they were before, chose of their own volition and desire to make this place for me? Even I will admit that this place is gaudy and over the top, but what kind of ruler would I be if I refused to accept gifts given to me out of love and support for my benevolent and glorious reign? Fascinating, Vale said in a mostly monotone voice. Now can you please let me up? I don't particularly like the idea that I am being confined for my own good. The last 5 people who did that wound up unintentionally chasing me away from their domain, and I would really hate to have to run from you as well. After all, I can get out of here whether you want me to or not, and therefore it is in your own best interest to avoid giving me reasons to bail and not want to see you ever again. This gave Zara some cause for concern. She mulled these words over in her head for a bit, still keeping Vale's head on her lap and the rest of his body bound tightly by her apet. It took her only a short bit of inner contemplation until she realized that there was indeed something to be said for not making her beloved so distrustful of her that he would simply run away and leave her alone. Thus, she acquiesced to his request, but on her own terms. Very well. I shall have my pet release you. However, I do desire that you stay here in the palace for a while longer. I will not force anything else too grand upon you, and neither will I demand you join me in bed, but I do require that you try and avoid conflict while you are here, both with my people and the invaders. I can risk neither you being harmed by a citizen of my nation nor by the hands of one of the damnable barbarians that seek to harm all of us. I shall deal with those savages myself. So please avoid personally fighting them. I cannot have you being injured again on my watch. Vale smiled a cheeky grin under his mask, but Zara did not seem to notice, thankfully. So, don't go to the front and fight them myself, right? Do not leave the capital of my nation and do not leave the palace. So, I can't leave the capital or the palace. Yes, and I can't personally go and fight them. Yes, that is correct. A broken bar. What are you planning? Nothing, Vale said dismissively. Sighing, Zara had her apet release Vale and then had General Ratams escort him to a private room which had been prepared for him over a century in advance. She knew he was plotting something, what with the way he had asked those questions, but she could not figure out what it was. A broken bar. Vale checked that Zara and Ratams were both asleep and then walked over to the window. He withdrew a small box from his inventory and called a distant descendant to one of his many animal-type tamed beings over to him. Take this and bring it there, he said while pointing out a place on a map. Once you get there, look for an object that you cannot fully comprehend and drop this box right at its base. Then get out of there as fast as possible. Do you understand, Archimedes? The white dove cooed and flew off with the box as another 15 birds of various types and sizes began to congregate near Vale, who began singing a version of a very old song. Step 1, put a bomb in a box. Step 2, give a bird the box. Step 3, wait for the bird to deliver the box. That's the way you do it. It was a normal day for the people of the Solution Dominion, and all was well for everyone. Well, mostly everyone. Actually, it was a normal day for those relatively far from the front line of the war that had been raging for a few years. For those on the edge of the nation, a normal day included hoping and praying that the Sand Peoples, that is Desert Elves/Sand Elves, didn't decide to push their advance in their general direction. Thankfully, there was some good news for those on the outskirts of the slowly shrinking Quendom. A divine warrior, called to the world by their pharaoh to do battle with the savages, wielding power unmatched by all save the God Queen herself, was causing the marauding barbarians to think twice about coming any closer. In fact, the sand-loving sadists had actually been pushed back in some places, and a few of their occult devices that they had been using to slowly squeeze the life and soul out of the Dominion had been utterly destroyed by that divine champion of the great pharaoh herself. To make matters even more positive, there was now a decently sized gap in the encirclement that had been isolating the Dominion from the outside world. Now that the net had a hole in it, the rest of the alliance that existed between their pharaoh and some other powerful beings now knew what was going on and, more importantly, that the Dominion had not been erased. These positive thoughts were universal, but the people who lived on the edge were still very much at risk. In one small town in particular, there was good reason to be a bit paranoid. One of the monsters had ridden into the town and demanded that the populace either evacuate and allow his people to take the town or that they save his kind the trouble and simply commit mass suicide. This was definitely a bad thing, as it meant that their home was next on the chopping block. Some did decide to take the savages' advice, only to return to town a few hours later and missing a large portion of those who had fled. Their reason for returning should be painfully obvious, but if it isn't then I'll clear it up here and now. The people fleeing the doom of their town were attacked by the Desert Elves once they were far enough away that any attempt to return back to their town would result in a great many deaths along the way at the hands of those dusty devils. So now, knowing that they were well and truly doomed, the populace began to panic. This became even more pronounced as the Sand Elves, in a rather uncharacteristic display of theatrics, formed up as a large force just outside of bow range. Those few who were brave enough to man the defenses knew full well that they would likely never be able to survive this, and that even if they did somehow emerge from all of this alive that they would be wishing that they hadn't soon enough. However, the people of the Solution Dominion were extremely superstitious, and when a flock of carrion birds flew over their heads and towards the marauders and then proceeded to circle over them, the people almost immediately calmed down and began to resist the fear that had grown inside of them. This flock of vultures hanging over their enemy was a sign, and it was surely a sign that the town would endure and that the vagabonds outside their settlement would feed the winged messengers that circled above them. What they did not know was that these vultures had not been sent by the divine pharaoh, but instead by the one who they thought was just a servant of their ruler. And, to make things even more bizarre, the birds were not just primitive animals, they were ultimately carrying a piece of their distant ancestors with them, and thus they had intelligence on the level of particularly bright 4-year-old. This was ideal for the duty that the master of mobs, monsters and miscellanea had given them. Forget bomb-delivering drones, Vale had bomb-delivering vultures. After all, why make a mess and not be responsible enough to clean it up? A broken bar. Me vulture, no name. Me very good bird, master say so. Master give me box that I supposed to carry someplace. Me find people that box need be drop on. Me not alone. Other birds here too, but they not as good bird as me. Master say box will make food when I drop it on bad guys. Me not know how small tree meat box make food, but me not care. Me do as master say and be good bird. Other birds say they here to drop box as well. Not fair. Me best bird, so me drop box first. Me drop box full box land on sand. Nothing happen. Other birds laugh. It not funny. Then, box make big sound and flash, like sky anger, but on ground there is dust and screaming. But me not sure what happen. Black ground cloud clears and bad guys not in very good way. Some ripped apart, others missing limb, others have insides on outside. See, me say, me be best bird of all. Other birds jealous. They drop box that they carry. Many box land on ground, wait for bit and then makes boom and fire. All birds have dropped their box. Some bad guys unhurt and run away. Me look down and see what master mean. Much food down there, many things to eat. Other birds shocked, but me is smart bird. Me go to food first and claim best munchies, leave other dumb birds behind and find good food. Find bad guy trying to crawl away. Bad guy has only one limb and looks very tasty. Come up to bad guy and try take a bite. Bad guy flails limb at me, but I quickest bird of all and bad guy miss. Bad guy is dangerous, need be killed quick or other dumber birds be hurt. Me smart and good bird, even to slow, dumber birds move neck and head quick, rip throat before bad guy can hit me. Soul man claw try to hold blood in, but can't and bad guy bleed out. Still alive when me take next bite. Fresh meat very tasty. Other dumber birds come down and join feast. We call others to come and eat from far away, but they need be fast. Was right to serve master as ancestors did. Master treat us well, give us box to make food with, make us happy birds. Me eat till full, then eat more. Have babies to feed, need lots. Me hear noise from large community nest for not bird creatures they happy. Me not care. Me have food and serve master, that only what matter. Me love master. If master was vulture, me would mate with. See, master? Me good bird, best bird. But need to eat and move if want to keep babies alive. Me fly off, go feed babies, come back and do again. Maybe master has more box for me to drop. Zara awoke the next day to a feeling she had not experienced in more than a decade. What she was feeling was, to put it mildly, a rapid increase in her authority over the realm she dwelt in, but accompanied with a not so insubstantial amount of rather enjoyable euphoria. She could feel the reach of her power expanding and covering more and more of what the savages had turned into a near lifeless desert, and she could feel that entire sections of the map that had otherwise been inaccessible to her power were now ripe for her intervention. She realized that she was correct in assuming that Vale would find some kind of loophole to exploit and allow his meddling in the war, but for the life of her, or rather, unlife of her, she could not figure out what he had done. She swept her near-omniscient gaze over the places that should have been beyond the reach, gazing down from above like the sun beating down on the world. What she found only made her even more confused. Where she could have sworn the unidentifiable objects had been, mostly due to rough guesswork, she found only scorch marks and the occasional loose limb and bit of mangled meat. She could piece together that some kind of explosive was used there, but how exactly was Vale able to send someone or something into those dead zones where everything that was even remotely loyal to him would just fall unconscious at best and outright die at worst? It did not make any sense at all. What kind of creature did her beloved have up his sleeves that was not only powerful enough to avoid falling to the effects of the objects, but also sneaky enough to avoid not only her attention, but that of all the other members of the Alliance? She kept shifting her gaze over to the edges of the few areas that she could not assert her dominance over, hoping to see what Vale had been doing that would allow him to strike these damnable creations of an unknown source without ever leaving the safety of the capital. Her eye darted about, checking every inch of the immediate area around the blocked off locations, but nothing could be seen except the occasional bird of varying size. It was only after another of one the objects were destroyed in a fireball visible from beyond the boundary of the object's field of influence that she began to piece the puzzle together. Vale had to be using some kind of creature that the barrier did not expect and work against to deliver a bomb of some kind to the target, and after she looked a bit harder at the sites that her AI had recorded she realized what was going on and how Vale was skirting the rules she had set out for him to follow. Birds were the answer to the question of how Vale had been delivering explosives to the objects. As she thought about it, it made a lot more sense than she had expected. The barriers were able to allow creatures that were not technically monsters into them, such as animals and even rhinolons, so it made sense that someone could use that loophole to deliver deadly cargo directly to their target. Birds were also much smarter than most people gave them credit for, especially corvids. But while corvids did not live around and in the Dominion or the desert, there were still a great many other birds that could be called upon, both native and imported. She still had no clue that, due to the long line that led from powerful tamed beings to the modern avians, Most birds were about as smart as a relatively intelligent 4-year-old, but that was knowledge that she didn't need. She had to hand it to Vale. He certainly did follow the letter of the law, if not the spirit of it. Still, this revelation had opened up a massive can of worms that needed to be addressed. She had refused to send her military into those dead zones after an entire army was lost to the barbarians. Said army had crossed the boundary and immediately fallen unconscious, only to be killed by the desert sand elves where they lay. She had assumed that this was due to the barrier being indiscriminate, but now she came to a very different conclusion. It was a hypothesis that needed to be tested, and she knew just the people for the job. You see, her hypothesis was based on a singular fact that the entire army she had sent was made solely of mummified warriors and constructs, without a single living person or animal amongst them. She was now going to test if only those who could be called monsters would be affected, or if she was correct in her assumption all those years ago and that everything of hers was targeted indiscriminately. A broken bar. So here we are. Ratams stood atop his chariot, his undead steeds just a few centimeters from entering one of the few surviving barriers that still stood defiant, despite needing to be protected by the desert sand elves. Go forth and show that you still have some loyalty to the Pharaoh left in those blackened hearts of yours. A group of barely clothed people stepped forwards, mostly due to the blades at their backs. The chains that bound them were not there because they were slaves, as such a thing was beyond illegal in the Solution Dominion. These were some of the few people in the Dominion to have given in to their darker side and committed acts so unspeakable that they deserved naught but death. Their chains led back to a large, sphinx-like construct that was a decent distance behind them. If they did fall unconscious upon entering the barrier, the construct could give a quick tug and almost instantly snap their necks. If they lived, they would be forced to remain in the barrier for a day or so until the experiment was completed. Move! Ratams shouted, and the blades pressed against the bare flesh of the prisoners, urging them forwards until they crossed into the area of influence created by the objects. Minutes passed, then an hour, then 3, then 10. By the time that the sun was back in the same place that it had been a day ago, the experiment had been fully completed and Zara was rather embarrassed that she had not figured this out sooner. The prisoners were still very much alive, although they were horribly sunburnt and dreadfully hungry and thirsty. But a quick tug by the construct permanently ended their need for food and drink in but a single motion. Zara's hypothesis was confirmed, and it was time for the Solution Dominion to stop relying on Vale to solve their problem and start going on the counterattack themselves. For the first time in a century, a call was sent out to all corners of the Dominion for living people and animals to join in on a great war to reclaim what had been stolen. For those who fought and distinguished themselves, land was to be given and wealth bestowed, with some being able to reach new heights in the ever-fluid caste system that governed the nation. It did not take long until the recruiting centers were swamped with more men and women wanting to take up arms than they knew what to do with. And, watching from beyond the skybox itself, the god of the desert, sand elves knew that it had fucked up. Ratams watched with growing pleasure as the soldiers of the Dominion, or at least the living ones, marched forth from their current position and made their way towards a desert sand elf encampment. Said place was housing one of the unfathomable objects that had been so much of a nightmare up till a brief while ago, and now that the secret of how to deal with their disruption field had been found out, all thanks to Vale and a bunch of birds, there was nothing to be feared from sending living people and animals into the object's area of influence. Ratams was indeed quite thrilled about this, but he also silently chastised himself for not being able to think of this solution earlier. It was an almost childishly noticeable solution to the problem that the objects had caused, and Ratams had been so caught up in the despair that the objects had infected him and the other servants of Zara that he failed to even attempt to find an answer, let alone one that was so brazenly obvious. Still, despite all that embarrassment, the realization of the critical flaw in the defensiveness of the objects was practically a godsend. If there was one thing that the Solution Dominion had over the Sand Peoples, it was their technological superiority. If there was another thing that could be listed, it was discipline, and, if there was third most important factor, it would be the sheer difference in numbers. It was, therefore, Rather simple for the Dominion to essentially build up several large forces and just march on the objects with the intent to destroy them, while the heavily tanned and pointy-eared barbarians certainly could just flee back into the desert and lose their pursuers quite easily. The objects could not. Those things were big, very hard to move, and were not exactly placed in the best position for rapid movement. Perhaps never expecting the Dominion to fight back in such a way, the objects had all been stood upright, like big, glowing, uneven obelisks, rather than laid on their side and on a sled for better mobility. Now, the forces of the Dominion were finally taking the fight to the enemy, instead of just waiting for them to come and fight on their own terms. Ratims was alerted each time an object was destroyed, and soon these last few would be reduced to dust. Once that was done, there would be nowhere for the sandy bastards to hide and no chance of them being able to deny the full and unbridled power of the Pharaoh from reducing them to scorch marks on the ground. A broken bar. Melach paced back and forth in his tent, his sense of dread growing with every step he took. It wasn't right. No, it wasn't just not right. It was utterly impossible. How could the creations of his God be so flawed? Could the true master of creation have just left him to die? No, that couldn't be it. Yes, the answer was so very obvious that it was almost insulting to his intellect. This was a test to see if he could lead his people to victory without the aid of the true God of creation. It was plain to see that by dividing their strength that they could not win. The objects would not save them. So they needed an alternative. What they needed was a place that they could start again from, some place that they could use as a base of operations that the forces of the Pharaoh could not hope to reach. Melach grabbed a roll of VLAM from a bin and rolled it open on the floor. The VLAM contained a rough map of the whole expanse that made up the Solution Dominion's former territory, which was now consumed by deserts that stretched for miles beyond the nation's current borders. If memory served, there was a large plateau that could only be reached by a long, thin, winding and very treacherous road that had been carved into the rock itself. On top of that plateau was the ruins of an old Dominion fortress, one that had been destroyed as it lost contact with the rest of the Dominion and was overtaken by the rapidly expanding desert. The top of the rock formation was still many kilometers above the surface of the ground, even despite the growing dunes that were slowly forming a kind of sandy ramp of its own. This place was the perfect hiding spot. It was uninhabited, out of the way, and already had some decent defenses. All Melach would need to do is get his people there. He didn't think twice and gave the signal to abandon the camps and the divine objects and set his people on what would later be known as a very ill-fated attempt to run from a rather angry raid boss and her servants. A broken bar. Meanwhile, in a place far beyond the confines of the New World, a single person existed in a state of limbo. To the world at large, he was either dead, in prison for life, on death row, or facing an agonizing torment in another virtual reality simulation. However, these were merely the theories and rumors surrounding his fate. No one, besides himself and a handful of others, truly knew what lies behind and in front of him. He was, at this point, a final contingency plan. It was painfully obvious to those in the know that the prison that housed the world's most destructive AIs was slowly crumbling and that there was no known way of fixing it. That was why he was still here, in some capacity or another. That was why he could not be allowed to die. When the walls of the prison came tumbling down, humanity needed a bit of leverage to keep the AIs from either destroying or subjugating humanity, and that, more than any other reason, was why he had been kept alive. He was still alive and kicking, but there was too much risk in letting him move around beyond the confines of a safe environment. There were those who either sought his death for the crimes perpetrated by the AIs or saw him as a kind of harbinger of the gods that they served. Thus, he languished in a tank somewhere far from everyone else, kept alive via injections and kept fit with muscle stimulation systems designed to keep coma victims from losing their muscle mass. Guarded non-stop by those hand-picked for their discipline and sense of duty, the man who was in some way responsible for the monsters that humanity had so much fear for floated in darkness, slumbering while those loyal to what once was and those loyal to the AIs fought over the world that currently was. Hidden from view and thought, the man behind veil drifted through a dreamless dream, oblivious to the horrors he had accidentally caused and how the world had to deal with them. Vale was bored. Sure, there was a lot to do in the capital of the Solution Dominion, but the raid boss turned God Queen refused to let him out of the palace. That was not to say that there wasn't a lot for someone to do there either, it was just that those things were duties performed by servants and court attendees. Vale could go for a bath in one of the many pools that were scattered about the place, but he did not want a repeat of what happened in the caves of the Chinerous Forest, not to mention that these pools were not for bathing or relaxing and instead were for rituals and ceremonies. Vale was getting rather tired of this effective house arrest, but he was less angered and concerned by it this time compared to the first time he had experienced it. He was not in any danger of being upped and used as a stud horse, and he had a lot more freedom to move around. He did, however, still want to leave the confines of his effective cell and help his tamed beings and their subordinates a bit more. Due to being kept in this place for what to him felt like far too long, his mood began to darken, and it became apparent to all who were within the palace and who saw him that he was beginning to dislike his accommodations. Luckily for the Solution Dominion, the wise and powerful pharaoh, Zara I, saw that her love was starting to show signs of wanting to flee and called him to her court. A broken bar. Vale walked into the throne room of the palace, the massive tree-trunk-style columns holding the ceiling up with magic being used to artificially reinforce the supporting beams. If it weren't for that, the spacing of the columns would have been too great and the roof would have collapsed down to the floor a long time ago. It was still like he was walking through a redwood forest made of painted stone and plaster, and to anyone with even a lick of sense the whole thing would have been both awe-inspiring and intimidating. Through skylights high above and via a series of magical mirrors, the light of the day filled what otherwise would have been a dark place. But what made the act of setting foot here all the more intimidating for the masses was the place where Zara I reclined. From behind her seemed to shine the light of the morning star, painting her body as a kind of hallowed silhouette that was staged several meters above the floor before her. To a normal person of the New World, Zara I would have seemed to be glowing with divine power. But to Vale it was painfully obvious that while she was indeed incredibly overpowered, the vast majority of the lighting was practical effects. Although, he had to admit that at least the old filmmaker J.J. Abrams would have been proud of all the artificial lens flare that was going on. Besides, he didn't even notice a lot of it without shifting his mask's vision levels. He thanked the developers and programmers once again for their willingness to add an option to most in-game IR that would allow for the lowering of bloom and other visual effects as he walked up towards the bottom of the stairs that led to Zara. As he reached the first step, the voice of a rather grumpy palace guard roared at him. "Kneel before the almighty Pharaoh." Vale looked at the unhappy person and then back to Zara. Before his tamed being could intercede, another voice followed the guards. "You fool of a foreigner, don't you know the manners of court?" Vale slowly turned his head to see a person who he was absolutely positive was not a native. The skin of this person was wattled a white too pale and his entire wardrobe was completely out of fashion for the area he was in. What made things even more ironic was the fact that he was obviously not following the procedures himself. His clothes were wrong, his stance was wrong, his tone was wrong, and his actions were wrong. At least the guard had the right to speak, but this guy? He likely was not even a part of the nobility of this nation. Vale turned back to Zara, ignoring the man who now seemed even more furious. The guards began to advance towards Vale, almost certainly in an attempt to force him to kneel, but they stopped midway and held their weapons at the ready as the second person to yell at Vale stomped forward and began to both yell in his face and try and force him to the ground. The idiot in question was almost certainly under level 20, and Vale had recently gained another level due to his bombing campaign, so the strength of the obvious outsider was not nearly enough to make Vale budge at all. Finally, having had enough of Vale's unmovable nature, the aggressive bastard decided the smart thing to do was to smack Vale across the face. Vale, for his part, saw the blow coming, and unequipped the mask in just the right way that when the palm of the other guy's hand struck it, the mask flew off and revealed Vale's face. As the mask slid across the floor, several things happened in short succession. First, Zara became even more furious with the fool than she had already been. Second, All the ladies in the room and for about 3 or so kilometers around instantly swooned. Third, all the men in the same vicinity immediately felt both inadequate and extremely impressed by Vale's overwhelming handsomeness. And finally, the idiot who started all of that went pale in the face and then proceeded to void his stomach all over the nice carpet that was beneath his feet. And, it was also at this moment, that the sounds of other people vomiting, this time in the rafters, tipped Vale off that someone either was planning a coup or that the sandy bastards had infiltrated the palace. Either way, Vale now had a lot of crotches to kick, and time was a-wasting. Putting his hand on the idiot who started all of this, Vale smiled warmly before landing his foot between the opposing person's legs. And with that, the party got started. It was at that moment, the period of time in which Vale's boot was placed firmly between the legs of the obvious plant, that the ball started rolling. The sound of people retching, hurling, and heaving wasn't lost on either Zara or her unneeded guards, who had long since put 2 and 2 together, even before Vale had arrived on scene. You don't get to be as powerful as they were without being able to spot such weak little wannabe spies like one would spot Waldo, or Wally, depending on regional variances, in an empty, pure white page of the book. In a flash, the people hanging out in the rafters were being targeted by spell and arrow alike, and said potential assassins were not in a very good position to either hide, flee or go on the offensive. In the end, while they tried to mount a counterattack, the mixture of arrows, spells, and feet planted between legs was enough to prevent any danger from rearing its ugly head. Unsurprisingly, the current session of court came to a very abrupt end, and not the end that Vale had wanted, although whether it was what was actually intended by another individual was still unknown to a certain player. Court would need to be resumed another day once the gunk was cleaned up and the smell was purged either by intense cleaning or via overwhelming amounts of incense. This did, however, leave Vale and Zara's relationship in a rather tenuous position, as the former was still effectively under a house arrest that he did not wish to endure. A more broken bar private meeting was therefore in order to sort all of this out, of course, and Zara knew just what to do to, hopefully, convince Vale to stay safe inside her palace. To her, it was rather enjoyable watching the whole show play out. She had known that they were there, of course, but being a being with her level of power, the whole thing they were almost certainly planning was too much of a chance to pass up. She had to see if they were really that dumb. After all, a broken bar. Vale was being escorted through the palace by a few guards who now had quite a bit more respect for their pharaoh's guest. Not only was he able to spot the assassination attempt that even they had been unable to notice, but he had actively participated in the defeat of said assassins and spies. To make matters even more intriguing, he had been hiding his godly attractiveness beneath his clothes, suffering through the heat to prevent his visage from having even the slightest chance of making anyone question whether he was more worthy of being called the truest embodiment of attractiveness than the pharaoh. Obviously, his humility was second to none. With his face having been revealed and causing as much of a stir as it had, it didn't surprise the guards that their divine pharaoh was calling for this outsider at this time of the day, and to her personal chambers no less. Once word got out about this, the rumors started circulating like nobody's business, and speculation abounded regarding whether Zara intended for this to be a one-night stand or if she intended to finally settle down and take a husband. After it came out that this outsider, Vale, was responsible for the discovery regarding the semi-hidden weakness of the unknown objects, and that he had used a bunch of birds to deliver numerous explosives to said objects. Well, then the rumor train effectively lost its brakes. Now Vale was being delivered to the pharaoh's private suite, and as he walked down the hallways the murmurs and whispers only grew in intensity. Once they reached the door separating them from the pharaoh herself, Vale fully intended to run if and when Zara tried to jump him. Unfortunately for those readers who were wanting a sex scene, Zara had no intentions of forcing herself on Vale anytime soon. At least, the normal side of her that wasn't dripping in the darkness implanted into her by the mage who shall forever remain unnamed had no intention of doing that. On the other hand, the other, darker side was waiting for any opportunity to take control of Zara so it could break Vale in and keep him forever, but that dog would remain in her cage for now. A broken bar. The knocking on her door was a sign that her summons had been answered. She did not get up from her reclining position, and instead ordered one of her handmaidens to open the door and direct not only Vale but the other guards in as well. She needed eyes for what was to happen here, even if only to prevent there from being rumors of her being a loose woman. She would use the very people who were expecting her to bang Vale as a tool to show that she could indeed avoid shagging anyone with a pretty enough face. She didn't want to be known as a ruler who could be manipulated via sexual gratification. After all, she was still a virgin. But in her eyes, one of the best part about being a god was that she was in some small way connected to all of her subjects and therefore had a wealth of experience, even if it was essentially second-hand. Not that such a thing mattered, as she had been keeping herself just for Vale, although she had no intent to force herself on him. No, in her eyes, a relationship was born best through mutual love and affections. To force your desires upon a partner who does not desire it would, at least to her, be a form of even if both were wed to each other. Yes, perhaps she was a bit idealistic, but when you have the kind of power and influence that she did, you could afford to be. Anyways, Vale and the guards were brought before her, and while the guards immediately got on their knees before her, Vale did not. All save Vale and Zara seemed unsatisfied by this, but they both knew exactly what kind of relationship they shared. I know you desire to leave this place, and I suppose you did show that not even this bastion of my might and control is safe from those who seek to bring my downfall. If they knew of the intricacies of our rather complex relationship, they would most assuredly come for you as well. Vale blinked several times under his mask. He did not expect Zara to talk like this. As a result of this little debacle and in order to avoid your ire, I will permit you to go wherever you wish, whenever you choose to. I do desire that you stay out of combat, but I can tell that you rather enjoyed making a mockery of my many mortal menaces, and therefore while I request that you keep your fights to a minimum, I will permit you to bring the wrath of us both down upon the foes of the Solution Dominion. That is all I called you here for, and whether you choose to stay here within this room or not is irrelevant. However, I refuse to let you stay here with me alone. Every moment you are here with me is a moment where the gossipers have free rein, so unless you are accompanied with an escort you cannot stay here with me. Are we clear? Vale just nodded and turned to leave. I just ask this one more thing of you, Zara said to Vale's back, which caused the player to turn. If you must flee, please let me know that you are safe and not lying dead on some sand dune in the middle of nowhere. All right? Vale looked over Zara, smiled under his mask, gave a thumbs up and left, leaving the murmuring crowds wondering what exactly had transpired to make the affair end so quickly. As events continued to transpire in the Solution Dominion, there were other beings hard at work elsewhere in the world. To be more precise, there were at the very least 5 beings doing their thing, and that thing was attempting to find Vale. Yes, you will know who and what this little side story is about, and what will come of it. The 5-clawed paw of the Rattan Under Empire was working its tails off trying to locate where their prize had gone, to minimal success at best. As one might expect, this was due to several factors, of which included Vale going very far away, the Under Empire not having expanded that far, the unfathomable objects which blocked much of the powers of those not a part of the races, and the author of this novel refusing to let them force Vale to leave the book early. And, with all of those factors at play, the crazy rat ladies were almost beside themselves with panic, fearing that without their love and daycare Vale had gone and gotten himself killed somewhere in the middle of fuck-all nowhere, leaving them without their heart's desire. In case you, dear reader, haven't noticed yet and are still hopeful that the crazy rat ladies view Vale as a person with rights and worth beyond being a mere tool for self-gratification and procreation, let me tell you now that said women did not in any way weep for a Vale, the person potentially being dead. No, they were afraid that their ticket to power, prestige, control and self-enjoyment was potentially gone forever. So, yeah, they were not missing his witty banter, his charming personality or his worth as a sapient being. They were missing the power and enjoyment that would have come if they had fully broken him and made him their toy without any other tamed being knowing. However, recently, and by recently I mean roughly 5 minutes ago by their time, They had been able to re-establish contact with someone they had long since thought lost forever. No, not Vale, but rather Zara I, the divine pharaoh of the Solution Dominion. While one of their number and thus not worthy of being called a god by their standards, the reveal that one of the fellow members of the old alliance was not, in fact, dead and instead had been isolated by some sort of weird barrier was a shocker to be sure. Now, the 5 most powerful Rattan in the world sat down with a long-distance magical holographic projection of the undead monarch, who was all too willing to chat with all the rest of the more powerful members of the alliance. All had been going swimmingly, if rather boringly, as Zara I caught everyone else up to speed on the events that led up to something big that she was refusing to reveal at the current moment, only saying that it was a surprise that she would reveal a bit later. As the talks dragged on, Cho and the other 4 nearly fell asleep several times, at least until the big reveal caused them to bolt to full consciousness. A broken bar, and so, that all leads to what transpired a relatively short while ago, the moment the tide began to shift into my favor with all the force of a great typhoon. Yes, it was at the time when that last village was put to the torch, when a hero we are all so very familiar with came to save the day and set in motion events that could not be stopped. Enough with the fancy words, shouted the current leader of the Greenskin Hordes. Get to the Veil-damned point already. I'm getting there. Just please be patient. You'll love who it was that showed up, you know, Zara replied, still rather coy about who and what was responsible for her nation's turn of fortunes. Please, little one, do not waste our precious time. I have a hoard of treasures to keep watch over and a nation to rule, so do hurry it up, grumbled a large, winged reptilian creature. If I must spoil it so quickly, then so be it. Our broken bar, Zara said with false sorrow and agony. Get on with it, was the nearly universal reply she was met with. Fine. It is Vale. Lord Vale has returned and was the one to help us here in the Dominion. Are you happy now? Zara's words were met with silence, but at least a few people in the group meeting were either at full attention or were now exceedingly interested in where their a prize had gone to. Is this true? Can the precious one really have returned to us? Asked a massive spider. I can attest that he has indeed returned, as can Blair and Durka. That is to say nothing of those 5 over there, who were the first to come into contact with him once he arrived in the New World, replied Nora, the current monarch of the Trelawney Kingdom. Eyes immediately fell first on the 2 beastmen, then on the bandit queen, and then lastly on the 5 Rattan, who were now feeling rather exposed. And none of you wished to inform any of the other members of the alliance that he had come back to us? Did you intend to keep him for yourselves? Demanded a being whose form was obscured with a large halo of light. We were also well aware of his presence on their plane, said a being formed of nightmares, evil and shadow. We simply felt it was best that he be allowed to do as he willed, wherever it was that he went. We are not his masters, thus, we have no right to decide his fate for ourselves. And yet you didn't tell anyone. We had reasons. Good reasons, but reasons we have no intention of disclosing. Ever, said a certain horned and horny rat woman. That aside, where is he at the current moment? Is he in a single location, under guard or what? Well, you little troublemaker, you may have to find that out yourself. I heard about what was going on from the source, Zara replied in a tone that was playfully malicious. We did nothing wrong, Cho growled, followed shortly by the nodding of the other 4 Rattan nodding furiously. In your eyes, perhaps. But no, I will not make your intended task any easier. Solution is a big place, so if you are going to try and take him for yourselves, you'd best start quickly. With how things are going, odds are you won't be able to reach your goal in time to claim your prize. All eyes were now on Cho and her fellow council members, which caused the 5 to shrink in their seats. Well, this certainly has been an amusing turn of events, muttered a large, kraken-like being whose voice and form seemed to not be that of a single being but of a mass of the Shinnic manifestation of others, which were all being spoken at once but vocalized not through a normal manner but by the entity's will vibrating the air itself. Yes, it has. Now shall we put this issue to bed and continue? The meeting continued on for a while after that, but nothing was as impressive as the bombshell that Zara had unleashed regarding Vale and the Rattan ruling council's pursuit of him. Once the conference ended, The five were stuck with a massive headache. While they had not been penalized in any way, they now had the eyes of the world upon them, and every move they made would be scrutinized in the extreme. But they now knew roughly where their prize was, and Vale, damn it, they were gonna get him if it was the last thing they did. Consequences be damned, they were gonna get some, and nothing was going to stop them from that. Vale, laying on his back in his room, immediately felt a chill run down his spine and the all-too-familiar feeling that he was being hunted once again. It was time to start prepping for an emergency teleport once again. Vale was now freed of his effective home imprisonment and was therefore free to go wherever he chose so long as he tried hard to keep himself safe. And, with the decades-long war between the Solution Dominion and the Desert Elves reaching its climax, he just had to be there for the last great battle. Right? Still, he could certainly see the pattern that had been emerging regarding his time with his tamed beings and their servants, so he had made broken bar preparations for what he figured was the inevitable appearance of one or more of those crazy rat women. Sure, it was 2 out of 3 times that they tried to spirit him away, but that was still the majority of the time, and because Vale understood fractions, he figured he might as well prepare himself for the appearance of the Rattan Council and their attempts to capture him, shifting from 66.66% to 75%. He did, however, figure that he couldn't use the same trick more than twice in a row, so he would have to rely on some other form of fast escape the next time he found himself faced with the Rattan after the one that was sure to come. Understandably, he was a bit worried, but he figured that he would be safer in the middle of the desert than in a major metropolitan settlement. The odds of the Rattan having a tunnel or two that led to the capital were astronomically higher than them having one that led to fuck all nowhere in a massive desert, right? This wasn't some NSC game where random monuments were placed in conspicuous spots for easy fast travel, and something told him that any attempt to make a tunnel in the massive dunes he was now running through would just collapse or be exposed by the shifting silt. So, while certainly concerned, he was not overly concerned. Besides, Zara would be watching him and would most certainly not take too kindly to him being kidnapped on her watch and in her territory. As Vale continued to pontificate about the future that he felt was inevitable, he eventually reached his destination, a massive war camp surrounding a high mesa that jutted out from the sands like a certain fresh prince's hair after said person was buried up to his hairline in the sand. Gazing up at the escarpment before him, Vale wondered for a moment how the forces of the Solution Dominion would get up there, but it seemed that they had at least one plan in mind. As Vale walked causally into one of the larger tents, the one that housed the generals as they plotted and planned to be more precise, he overheard that at least one of their plans had fallen through. I can't believe that they would cut themselves off like that. Indeed, Lord Akinamun, even I hadn't imagined that they would simply collapse the entire tunnel leading up their broken bar. The only other options at this point are to either scale the near vertical cliffs or to attempt to repair the damaged road that wound up the whole formation, and we lack the materials needed for the latter and the bodies needed for the former. True, were it not for their position, we would have been more than able to storm them and destroy their final few accursed objects, but now we cannot, and thus the undead cannot risk themselves by taking arrows, slings, stones and magic for the living. And yet there are some who wish for the Pharaoh to come here personally and wash away the savages with her cleansing light. How could we tell them that these twisted creations of some unfathomable entity prevent our beloved goddess from wielding her power effectively? You don't. Vale's words caused those who were partially despairing and those stoically facing their fate to look over to him. Standing partially in the doorway, Vale smiled from beneath his mask. And what does the Pharaoh's newest pet think it can do to stop these issues from endangering our noble mission? Vale's face fell beneath his mask, but he didn't let the general's lack of understanding get to him for long. He held the flap leading into the tent open a while longer and a large mole-like creature popped up from the sand just outside the threshold. This adorable little thing that looked a bit like a Mtmla from the Rio games crossed with a chinchilla was soon accompanied by tens and then hundreds of others of its kind, all of whom were equally as adorable. "What are these supposed to do?" asked one of the generals. But rather than Vale speaking, The first critter to appear spoke instead. So these da gays was supposed to help, eh? Datings des to pash ta folk in gdru da san lake use, huh? What? Datings des better than news? This rather uncommon and rather uncouth dialect caught the generals off guard, but Vale came to their defense. No, my friend, I am the one asking for help on their behalf. They are fully aware of how good you guys are at clearing debris, building things and more. Anyways, want a beer? I've got more than enough for the lot of you. The first mole chinchilla looked up at Vale and held out his hand, which Vale filled with a chilled can of generic beer he withdrew from his inventory. The creature opened the can and chugged the whole thing before crushing the can in his hands and tossing it to one of the others of his kind who caught it and popped back underground. Now that's da stuff, ya know. Where's still get stuff ya back for what ya did for yous all them years ago, ya know? If ya's gonna be sweetenin' da deal with dis stuff, who's where's ta refutes, eh? The creature then turned back to his fellows and withdrew a mining helmet from nowhere before placing it on his head. Gays and goils, where's got's a job ta do? Let's make dis summon special, ya lazy lugs. Woiktm, everybody. All as one, the critters took out their helmets, once again from seemingly nowhere, before placing them on their heads and popping back underground. Soon after, the sounds of construction work could be heard from several parts of the mesa, both near the bottom and around the middle. Vale stood there in the doorway for a while, looking over at the generals with a smug, shit-eating grin on his face, but hidden under his mask, of course, before walking out into the camp to find a place to put up a tent of his own. Melak looked down from his high perch atop the mesa, scowling as he watched the servants of the most destructive of beings mill about as if they had some way of getting up to his position without incurring extreme loss of life. Once his people had established the ruined fortress up where they were as their last holdout, they had made perfectly sure to eliminate any and all means of scaling the mesa. The air-hidden tunnel route that led directly into the fort itself was sealed with sand and rubble, while the path that wound up the cliff face like a massive corkscrew had been rendered unusable unless the bridges, tunnels and more open paths were rebuilt, repaired, and remade. And, while the sounds of construction that came from down near the base of the massive rock did alarm him, he figured that it would take the living servants at least a few years before they could reach the midway point. He had left the entire path up in such a terrible shape that heavy equipment would be needed to haul away the collapsed roofs, remake the long bridges and reinforce all the areas that he and his people had intentionally rendered structurally weak. What little work that was being done was surely not nearly enough to make any major progress. After all, his people could see far from their current residence, and they had not seen the arrival of heavy equipment. If they wanted to get such things to the work site, they would need to do so under the cover of night or bring it all in piece by piece. Plus, the evil Dominion could not rely on undead or enchanted devices to make their job easier. The gifts from the true god saw to that. Still a bit miffed about the whole situation he found himself in, Melak retired for the night and reminded himself that he and his could afford to play the waiting game while those down at the bottom could not. The desert was a harsh place, and those Dominion bastards were not suited for long-term exposure to it. Even if the damned Pharaoh was pushing back the sands, he figured that he had at least a half-decade to wait until any meaningful progress was done by his foes. A broken bar. Yaz got star goods. Ma Mainman. The whole group of diminutive construction workers had gathered around Vale and were practically begging for his to bless them with booze and snacks. For every one of you who has pulled your weight, I grant you these, Vale said in a showy fashion as he pulled a large but thin piece of cloth off of a wooden frame that was filled with cans of generic beer and bags of tomato chips. All at once, the little creatures raised their hands into the air and shouted as one in their unique dialect before rushing to have their fill. Vale watched as the little critters drank and ate until they were too full to move before passing out in a heap while wondering to himself how the hell they were going to recover and get back to work the next day. A broken bar. Oi! A general of the Solution Dominion was walking through the construction site as he heard the shout of one of the strange creatures from behind. Oi! Listen up, gay eye! I'm fucking talking to ya. Moran. Stopping in his tracks at the insult, the general turned around and saw the critter offering him a metallic helmet like the one it was wearing. "Ya don just not wear a safi helmet Tenawoik sate, Yajit Puetan for summon kells ya. I am not wearing a piece of trash like timber." The sound of one of the creatures yelling caught the general's attention and he barely moved out of the way in time as a bit of rock fell from the ceiling and almost hit him in the head. "That's way I was where these things wada been able to just ketufn ya wardis, Yano." The general was smart enough to realize there was truth in the creature's words, and he wisely accepted the helmet. "Nah, ita get out da waya go back where ya came from. Wes doing some hard work here and wes don need ya making use half ta triple check everything." A broken bar. Melak was not having a good day. As his scouts had put it somehow, the Dominion was rebuilding everything at an alarming pace. While only able to operate at night, taking care while slowly rappelling down the cliff face, those who were tasked with monitoring the work of the Dominion only had bad things to say. It was only the 5th day after the construction began, but the lower third of the corkscrew path was nearly finished being remade. Worse still, the repairs were to such a degree that they may have been improvements to the original. Something had to be done, and Melak knew exactly what he had to have happen. A broken bar. "Folk in folk de folk in fok fok." The moleman foreman yelled as he looked over the sabotage that had taken place last night while he and his people had been partying. "It certainly looks like you need some security personnel," a broken bar Vale remarked. "Damn folk in straight where's folk in do. Lemme make some calls and I'll be right back, ya dig." A broken bar. Melak's saboteurs slowly crept into the construction site, ready to take hammers to anything and everything they could. "Oi, Nimn Arts. Tink fast." One of the saboteurs turned to face the sound, only to have a pickaxe lodge itself in her face, killing her nearly instantly. As the saboteurs began to take fighting stances, the ground around them popped as molemen wearing much heavier construction gear and wielding weaponized shovels, mallets, pickaxes and other construction tools came from underground and began to fight their foes. While there were only a few mighty molemen, they were not alone, as a saboteur found out the hard way when a Dominion arrow suddenly seemed to appear in his neck. Light soon filled the makeshift battleground as lanterns whose lights were focused by many mirrors blinded the sand elves and exposed them for the construction helmet-wearing Dominion archers to take potshots at. Of the 20 or so desert elves that made the most recent sabotage attempt, only 2 made it back to the top of the mesa, and only after taking no small amount of damage. Before then, things were going swimmingly for the Solution Dominion in its attempt to repair the damages done to the paths that led up to the top of the mesa. The moleman workers had done an excellent job so far, even going so far as to stop themselves from excavating that last few meters of sand and debris that prevented the Dominion from waltzing in through the back door. Although this was not due to them not wanting to, but rather due to the tactical advantage that would come from their allies assaulting both entrances, exits at the same time. As any military man would tell you, surprise is a hell of a weapon, but one that is often quickly spent. The desert elves, for their part, made the occasional attempt to hinder the work of the molemen, but this did not have the desired effect. What little damage they could inflict before being chased out, usually with a few members wounded or even killed, were quickly repaired, and the construction would then continue again regardless. Each day that came and went saw the path that spiraled up the mesa covered in more and more people and fortifications. It seemed that the Dominion already had plans for what to do with the place after they had retaken it, and further reinforcing the main entrance, exit against any assault from without further lowered the odds that their prize would be stripped from them ever again. Vale was still busy doing his shtick of sending birds to scout and occasionally drop high explosives, but the desert elves were now wise to his antics and actively targeting any bird that even remotely looked like it was carrying anything at all. But this didn't stop Vale in the slightest, as he had many other critters to call on, and even if he didn't want to use non-birds, he still had millions more feather-day friends where the fallen had come from. As a result, the bombing campaign continued relatively unabated, with the desert elves getting increasingly nervous whenever they were out in the open. As for the leader of this last holdout, Melach had learned a valuable lesson from Vale's bird bomber campaign, and had done something he never thought he would have to do, and buried the objects granted to him and his people by their new god into the ground, completely preventing any of the dropped bombs from damaging them or even destroying them. This action was a desperate ploy to keep the veteran undead warriors of the Solution Dominion from assaulting the Mesa Top Fortress, but it was one that would ultimately amount to nothing, as after hearing enough recon reports from the many critters he had sent to scour the place, Vale had realized what Melach had done. He had to give the bastard props. He had come to a reasonable conclusion regarding the danger to his ace in the hole and created a useful counter to that threat. But Vale was no one-trick pony, and hard a broken bar other ways of dealing with the objects. Despite Melach's tactical decision being useful against aerial bombardment, it was a useless defense against subterranean methods of destruction, and the molemen were more than happy to oblige Vale's request so long as they got some decent grub out the deal. And thus, without the Sand Elves being any the wiser, their protection against Zara and her legions of undead subordinates were removed and taken a few tens of miles from the base of the mesa, also that those objects could be destroyed far, far away from the senses of the desert bastards. A broken bar. Zara could feel it. The time of her final victory against those who had harmed her people for decades without facing any justice or judgment was at hand, and there was naught left to stop her from raining down her vengeance from above. With the final barriers that kept her from flexing her power in the area now removed, there was nothing to get in the way of either herself or her undead subordinates, let alone the masses of very angry members of the living who wanted their pound of flesh, so to speak. Still, she wanted the sandy assholes to feel true despair at her arrival, just as so many of her nation's citizenry had felt when Melach and his kin had come to claim their unjust desires. Simply arriving in the day was not good enough. No, to truly drive those monstrous mongrels to the depths of fear and sorrow, she had to bring the bulk of her forces to bear during the night when the Sand Peoples could not see nearly as well. Perhaps due to being a raid boss, Zara had developed a bit of a flair for the theatric, and she would give her foes a show to die for. Pun intended, of course. A broken bar. Melach tried to get some much-needed sleep, but the sounds of the Dominion's massive camp singing songs and partying into the latest hours kept him awake. He had been kept from sleep for a good day and a half, either due to the noise of construction that had essentially reached its completion point or due to the stress that came with his position and the noise made during both day and night. Now he knew that there was little hope for survival unless his god did something drastic, but he was seemingly being ignored or simply had been cast aside. If his calculations were correct, he would have to join his kin in a battle to hold back the Solution Dominion at the entrance to the fort that his people had stolen from them. The thought of a war of attrition against a foe whose military numbers exceeded his by at least 10 to 1 was not one that would let him sleep at ease. As dawn broke on the 40-hour mark of his insomnia, he heard the sounds of the massed troops of the Dominion sink into silence. This was a broken bar, unusual to say the least, and both intrigued and terrified the both great and cruel man immensely. Rising from his folding bed, he lifted the flap of his tent and walked out towards the edge of the mesa. He peered out into the growing light, only to be nearly blinded as the sun peeking over the horizon filled his eyes. He winced in pain before squinting and holding one of his hands up to help him see, but he soon wished that he hadn't. The final approach to the top of the mesa was filled with soldiers of the Solution Dominion, and worst of all they were the elite of the elite, led by the infamous General Ratams himself. But that wasn't all that was there. In between formations of undead troops were constructs made of stone and metal, and in front of all of those was a figure that Melach could never forget. Said figure was the pharaoh herself, Zara I, standing proud atop the head of a massive black and purple serpent whose body wrapped around parts of the mesa and towered over even the largest of the standing ruins in the occupied fort. Melach knew what this meant, but he refused to believe it, and was held in the grips of terror until the voice of Zara I echoed throughout the area. Rejoice, villainous scum, for I shall grant you my mercy. You have but 3 hours to deliver unto me the leaders of your marauding band, and should you refuse, then my mercy shall be spent and I shall bring justice for the fallen by the form of fire and sword. I advise that you take my offer of clemency, as there exists naught but immeasurable suffering for those that deny my most benevolent gift. Make your choice, and make it soon, for the sands in the hourglass have started to fall, and if you resist then so too shall you. Vale watched the witty banter between Zara and every other sand/desert elf who thought that they could somehow convince Zara that her desire to see them beaten, broken and their leader dead was not ethical with a growing sense of amusement. He had already identified Melak among the crowd of not just men, but women and children who stood united in their defiance of not just the Solution Dominion and Zara, but also of common decency and morality. Watching them use their dogma and blind zealotry to try and justify their heinous actions, only to have Zara rip massive holes in their arguments was a damn fine way to pass the time. It was almost like watching a pro-debate team tear a bunch of middle school students a new one, with the Sand People's replies growing less and less rational and more emotional. Eventually, Vale felt a little bad for them as some just broke down sobbing as they had their entire belief system and moral code ripped apart in front of them without any one of them being able to give an adequate response. Despite this one-way debate going on for a while, it didn't stop the time left for the Sand Elves to hand over their leadership, Melak included, from running out. Seated at his position above the whole thing and upon a floating doormat, because normal flying rugs are too expensive to maintain and too delicate to use, Vale's face under his mask shifted into shock as Zara announced that the time that she had given the desert elves was now up. Dida broken bar, did she seriously just make them unknowingly waste all their time in a pointless debate so that they couldn't deliberate? Vale couldn't believe it. But it seemed that his assumption was spot on, as immediately after announcing that the allotted time was up, the rear entry into the ruined mesa-top fortress broke open, and from the hidden tunnel around 100 elite undead mummy soldiers began to give the Sand Elves a reason to stop standing around like idiots. Vale continued to shovel popcorn into his mouth and take the occasional sip of root beer from a permanently frosted mug, enjoying the battle as it unfolded before him. He saw the giant purple and black monster of a king cobra ram its face through the last barrier, preventing the majority of Zara's forces from storming the fort, barely catching sight of Zara jumping off the creature's head mere moments before impact. Vale was far enough away that the whole thing looked a bit like a cinematic from a fantasy RTS, but he knew that people were dying on both sides. Thankfully, it seemed that he would be able to take it easy for a while and not need to run away. An alert from Vale's minimap caused him to curse under his breath and look skyward. It was from the sky he saw what appeared to be a grain of black rice, but the size of the grain was gradually getting bigger. He focused his sight to its maximum and then immediately began activating the quick escape random destination teleport he had previously prepared. Fuck, 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 fuck. Fuck. Work faster, Vale growled with growing anxiety and fear as the object falling towards his position seemed to sprout 5 thin nubs, which could eventually be seen to be 4 limbs and a tail. His vision rapidly shifted between the battle unfolding a few miles away, his slowly activating escape plan, and the figure of a Grima's Greasks falling towards him. It wasn't until just before the two collided that both of them spoke the same words, but for entirely different reasons. I hope this works. A broken bar. How had Grima started falling towards Vale? That question can be answered rather simply. She jumped. More specifically, she had jumped out of a plane. Why did she jump out of a plane, dooming it to fall out of the sky and crash into the ground rather than using Cho's magic to open a portal and hop through? That answer is also rather simple. She built a plane, so she wanted to use it and none of the others could convince her not to. Also, the plane's engine was on fire and the flames were spreading to the fuel tank. But it wasn't all bad. At least she now got to self-test her prototype parachute. Yes, about 87% of the Radan and other 8 test subjects that were equipped with this device and were thrown off a cliff didn't have the A-chute open. But she was an overleveled beast of a creature and a bit of face meets ground would not be that big of a deal. Ideally, the parachute would have opened by now and she would have slowly fallen towards her target, which would have allowed her to grab hold of Vale and then signal for Cho to pop open a portal and get the both of them back to a safety. But, since her nose was now about 3 feet from Vale's masked face, She merely hoped that Vale could withstand the impact. It would be a very dark day if she had to hook Vale's dead body up to that machine again, especially now that all the other members of the Alliance knew that Vale was not only alive but currently in the Solution Dominion. If she accidentally killed Vale via faceplant, she would never be able to live it down. Thankfully, Cha had never been discovered as the one who had been the first to accidentally kill Vale, so there was at least some solace that that story in particular had not reached anyone's ears. As she held open her arms, hoping that by grabbing hold of Vale as she plummeted, she would be able to keep him safe, she saw a bright flash of lights around her people's prize, and in the next moment, Vale was gone. Pissed to high hell that Vale had yet again slipped through the council's fingers, Grima didn't even notice that the ground was fast approaching. It was less than a half-minute later that she slammed face first into the sand with a massive whumph, which was, rather comically, shortly followed by her parachute deploying and draping her in a large patchwork of cloth and rope. If anyone with enough knowledge of Earth pop culture had seen that transpire, they would almost certainly wonder whether the Acme Corporation was responsible for Grima's parachute, plane, and manner of thinking. Vale was now somewhere else, and the Rattan would once again have to quickly cover up their involvement in Vale's flight from the territory of one of their allies. Not that they did an especially good job the other 2 times, but at least they were trying, right? While Vale was panicking and prepping his escape in order to avoid a skydiving Rattan whose parachute worked about as well as a certain genius coyote's, Zara was leading her forces to the final, decisive victory over her most recent major adversaries. She had commanded her APET to smash its way through the last major barrier protecting the desert, sand elves from her forces, and it did so with slavish devotion. Such was the power of the binding spell and psychological reconditioning on that combination of 2 of her most terrible foes that Zara hardly needed the hieroglyphic enchantments and magical talismans that had been either seared into or embedded within its flesh in order to control her APET. At this point, her tool was essentially nothing more than just that, a tool. It had no real will of its own, and thus it made for the perfect sponge to absorb the fire from the desert elves now that they were fighting back. As her supremely sized scaled serpent smashed its skull through stationary sandstone, Zara slipped into the sky and unleashed the sunlight suffused smack to the surface of the mesa-top stronghold. With that strike, waves of solar force spread out from all sides, searing flesh and scorching stone with the same heat of a miniature star. Yes, the alliteration is done now. No, I am not ashamed. Anyways, that one-fisted ground pound was enough to reduce more than 50 people in the immediate vicinity to permanent shadows painted onto the ground and walls, while many more were either blinded by the light or had their clothes and skin be set on fire by the thermal energy unleashed in that brief moment. Thankfully for Zara's people, both living and undead, a powerful ward had been placed up ahead of time to allow the heat and pressure to wash over and around them instead of through them. Now they merely had to wait for the ambient heat to die down so they could begin their assault. Zara stood up in the middle of the near-molten crater she had created and sent a quick glance towards a place far off into the sky. A smile formed on her lips as she chuckled quietly. She had expected that the Rattan would try and pull something, but building a heavier-than-air stealth aircraft in order to sneak into her lands and unlawfully steal what rightfully belonged to everyone was something she had not expected. Still, the craft was now on fire, falling from the sky, and its pilot was face-first in the sand, a canvas of shame draped over the rat both figuratively and literally. It did appear that they had at least one contingency plan to use, as a short while later the offending rat was whisked away from her failure by a portal. Zara could have used this as grounds for all manner of things, but she was more of the mind that so long as Vale did not end up being captured things were relatively fine. She turned her head from the distance and back to the scenery around her, watching the survivors of her little mini-nuke of a superhero landing crawl around in agony or try and peek their faces out from their hiding spots. She waved her hand and immediately the temperature in the area dropped considerably, causing the victims of her attack to howl even louder. Anyone with a lick of engineering sense will tell you that superheating something or someone and then dropping that object's temperature back to a normal will cause massive damage to the entity's structural durability. And that effect was now bestowed upon people who were suffering from temperatures hot enough to cause their skin and clothes to burst into fire. Dropping the temperature down from that to around 100 degrees Fahrenheit in less than a second was enough to cause those currently alive to wish that they weren't. Even the ruins of the fort were now even more heavily fatigued than they had been prior, and as a result, some of them collapsed on the heads of those who hid within them. However, as previously stated, Zara's troops were untouched by the heat and therefore had nothing to worry about. Columns of her troops advanced through the breach as Zara called her serpent ape to her and shrunk it again to the size it usually was in. The snake coiled up to act as a throne for its master, and Zara watched the carnage play out before her. A broken bar. Melak huddled under some rubble as the sounds of violence rang out throughout his final retreat. He was hiding, but also waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike at the damnable pharaoh. He would kill her, and he would be the martyr that would help prevent the end of the world from happening. If this monster and its ilk were able to challenge the true God, they could cause an event that would result in the whole of the world he lived in being erased. It would be bad enough if that happened, but if they managed to win it would be even worse, as those that Melak's God sought to protect would be the next to suffer. As a building nearby collapsed, it allowed the hidden desert, sand elf to advance. He hoped that he would remain unseen, and his hope was seemingly fulfilled. He crept closer and closer until he was within distance for a single strike. He held his God-blessed dagger tightly and then leapt from his cover. For great justice! He yelled as he flew through the sky, only to grabbed from behind and held in a full Nelson by a shriveled old mummy who was decked out in all the regalia befitting his position. "Found you at last, you damn monster!" Ratams shouted as he changed up his grip and German suplexed Melak, knocking the wind out of the sand elf. Ratams then bent back up while changing his grip once again, this time grabbing Melak by the ankles and whipping the ruler of the sand people over his head and face first into the ground. After that little two-hit grappling combo, Ratams proceeded to swing Melak to his left and hurl the dazed member of the races into a still-standing piece of the ruined fort. The stone was barely durable enough to endure Melak's abrupt and physical introduction to it, and Melak was still drastically under-leveled in comparison to his foes. Ratams picked up the dagger that Melak had dropped during the scuffle and immediately dropped it again before picking up his personal greatsword of a massively oversized khopesh and hacking the offensive object to tiny pieces. Melak slowly stood up. He was now barely conscious, but he could not allow himself to go down without a fight. "Is that a broken bar?" "Or you can a broken bar, master?" "Am a broken bar still standing?" "I will a broken bar remain so until a broken bar I win." "I want a broken bar, let the world end a broken bar by your hands." Zara looked over towards the nearly dead man, but there was neither pity nor admiration in her eyes, only the cold and simmering rage towards Melak and his people that had built up over the decades that the war had been going on. "You're standing, are you?" Zara asked with contempt, extending her finger to point at Melak before firing a thin beam of magic from her fingertip and through Melak's right knee, severing his lower leg from the upper part while cauterizing the wound. "Do you still stand?" Zara's cold question was met by Melak bracing himself against his pain and the wall behind him as he lifted himself up on his remaining whole leg, only for that knee to be shot out from under him and leaving him with nothing but his two upper legs and nothing beneath. "I don't hear no bell," Melak yelled against his suffering, to which he was met with a magic blast severing his lower right arm from its upper part and a second shot doing the same to his left arm. Melak strained to keep himself from screaming and giving his foe any kind of satisfaction, but he figured his death would be almost as swift and quite soon. Maybe the twisted monster would shoot a hole through his head, lobotomizing him. Maybe she would behead him and take his severed cranium as a trophy. Maybe she would set him on fire or even draw and quarter him. None of these were Zara's way of dealing with Melach. Zara calmly stood up from her serpentine seat, and the massive creature slithered towards the now crippled sole survivor of his marauding forces. Melach saw the snake getting closer and chuckled that he would die by fast-acting venom, but as the snake crawled closer and opened its maw, Melach began to realize his death was not going to be so quick or painless. "You fucking monster!" His shouts were cut off as Zara's snake swallowed the sand elf whole. This was how Zara wanted to get rid of her foe. After all, being slowly digested by a giant snake, something that could take days, if not weeks to deal with ingested prey, and then being shot out at a later date was terribly funny as a form of execution, at least in Zara's eyes. A broken bar. Vale's eyes opened after the bright flash and realized that he was hanging upside down in a cave. It was not an ice cave, so there were no abominable snow monsters, nor were there any signs of the Ratan. No. He was hung upside down by one foot, and that foot was stuck to a bunch of spider webs. Vale pulled himself up and managed to get himself loose from his predicament, only to fall and land not so gently on the rocky floor of the cave. Standing up and collecting himself, Vale opened his minimap and walked towards what he assumed was the exit of the cave. He never noticed the countless arachnid eyes gazing out from all sides, feeding their sight to a greater being. That creature would have smiled a true twisted smile if it could, but being a massive spider, one the size of an Olympic stadium to be precise, meant that it lacked such features. Still, it now had a chance to do what those stupid rats had failed to do. Vale would belong to itself, and no one else.